Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we enter a world gilded with jewels but burdened with shadows, where crowns are heavy not only with gold but with hidden sorrow. Picture yourself wandering through an echoing hall, torchlight flickering against marble columns, velvet curtains exhaling the smell of old dust and wax. Somewhere in the rafters pigeons stir, but down here every whisper carries the weight of history. You probably won't survive this court if you speak too loudly. Palace gossip can be far more lethal than swords. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time of night is it for you? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins in candlelight. You're not just an observer. You're drifting barefoot across cold stone floors, eavesdropping on courtiers who keep their voices hushed, as though afraid of being overheard by marble busts lining the walls. They speak of a strange curse, a thread woven through dynasties, where heirs are born with tender faces and fragile frames, touched by what we today call Down syndrome. But in the centuries before medical textbooks, it was simply the crown's sorrow, an unspoken blemish hidden behind brocade curtains. You move closer, and the chandeliers drip wax like slow tears. The whispers tell you that royal families guarded their bloodlines as if they were sacred relics, yet every tightening of the gene pool made fate play dice with fragile children. No one dared admit it outright. In the Middle Ages, and even later, what we recognise today as chromosomal difference was often confused with signs of divine punishment, or the meddling of fate, or, more cruelly, weakness unfit for the throne. One fact still flickers in this dim hall. Throughout Europe, marriage was not about love, but strategy. Princesses were swapped like chess pieces to secure alliances. You can almost see them now, brides arriving on barges across the Thames or through Alpine passes, greeted by crowds who didn't know that along with gowns and dowries came invisible risks carried in their blood. Historians still argue whether these unions of cousins and uncles, intended to bind empires together, ended up sowing the seeds of fragile heirs. Your steps echo through another corridor where portraits stare back at you. Stiff faces painted in oil, their pale cheeks powdered, their eyes dark and solemn. Some of these children never lived past infancy, yet their likeness was preserved in gilded frames, as though the act of painting them could preserve the dynasty's honour. There's a fringe tidbit here. One Spanish painter in the Habsburg court was quietly instructed to soften certain features of royal children on canvas, to make them look more normal. Imagine being the royal artist, brush in hand, nervously smoothing away signs of disability because the truth was too dangerous for public eyes. You feel the air change. The hall grows colder. Somewhere behind the doors, prayers are being whispered. Religious ceremony was often the balm to these wounds. If a child seemed frail, priests murmured that God's will was at work. You picture monks gliding across cloisters, their candles reflecting off polished chalices, muttering blessings over infants who were never expected to live long. The burden of these whispered prayers wasn't just about the child's survival. It was about the survival of dynasties, treaties, and entire nations balanced on fragile shoulders. Now, imagine yourself as one of those parents, a king, used to commanding armies, suddenly powerless before the crib. A queen, dressed in silk, clutching rosaries until her knuckles turned white. They didn't have a name for Down syndrome, but they had fear, and plenty of it. Behind the velvet drapes of a nursery, courtiers would peek in, their expressions carefully neutral, then step out to spread gossip in coded phrases. One lord might say, "The prince is delicate." Another might whisper, "The child has an angel's smile," which everyone knew was a euphemism for something else. In the hall you walk through, you catch the scent of beeswax, of lavender sachets stuffed into corners to hide the smell of sickness. You hear the shuffle of maids who rock cradles slowly, humming lullabies that sound more like laments. History books rarely dwell on those songs, but think of it. The same nursery where the lullaby was sung might also be the chamber where succession papers were drafted, already preparing for the possibility that this child would never rule. Here's your first reality check. The fate of empires once hinged on children who might not live past 5 years old. Can you picture a parliament debating taxes while everyone knows the heir in the nursery upstairs can't even walk? You'd want to scream at the absurdity, but of course you'd lower your voice to a whisper, because here, whispers travel faster than cannon fire. Now, let's pause on a historical fact that cuts through the candle smoke. The survival of medieval and early modern dynasties depended not only on producing children, but on producing healthy, visible heirs. In England, for instance, the Wars of the Roses erupted partly because of disputed claims. Imagine how fragile those claims would be if heirs were hidden due to disability. You lean against a pillar and listen to a more eccentric detail. In some courts, particularly in Central Europe, people believed that a child with unusual features was touched by angels. Rather than admit disability, families sometimes cloaked it in mysticism, claiming the child was special, closer to heaven than earth. Of course, that didn't put them on the throne, it simply explained away their absence. Historians still argue whether certain unnamed princes and princesses recorded as infirm or gentle of mind in chronicles were in fact early cases of Down syndrome. The ambiguity leaves shadows in the record, and you, Night Owl, are standing in that shadow now. Picture the palace at night. The fires have burned down to embers. Somewhere in a chamber, a nurse rocks a child whose breathing is shallow. In another chamber, diplomats are plotting marriages, already overlooking the frailty upstairs. It is this dissonance between soft lullabies and sharp treaties that defines the curse. And here comes your first gentle joke of the night. You can almost imagine the courtiers writing in their diaries, "Dear journal, the air is delicate. Again. Should I even bother polishing my shoes for the coronation?" That's the strange humour of history lives decided by chance genetics, dressed up in ceremony. The hall stretches onward, and you pass tapestries depicting hunts and jousts. Irony strikes you. These displays of power and virility stitched in gold, hanging right outside nurseries where fragile heirs struggle to survive. The dynasty wanted to show the world strength, but inside its most private chambers, weakness gnawed like moths at silk. As you glide further, you overhear echoes of a debate that continues even now. Was the so-called curse really genetic isolation, or was it exaggerated by enemies spreading propaganda? After all, nothing undermines a king like rumours that his son is unfit to rule. You can almost see a rival noble smirking in candlelight, whispering into the right ears, "The child can't even lift his head." Is this who you'll trust with armies? Your journey takes you through a gallery of armour, gleaming breastplates, swords heavy with jewels. You pause before one suit that seems too small, perhaps made for a child who never grew enough to wield it. The hush of the hall makes you imagine the ceremonial fitting, the child's delicate hands struggling with the weight of steel. That image lingers as you step on. Another whisper drifts your way, this one almost comical. One French courtier once claimed that the king's heir was so angelic he needed no crown. Translation: the poor boy was unlikely to survive long enough to wear it. Humour was a survival tactic then, just as it is now. You chuckle under your breath, realising that sarcasm has always been a shield against tragedy. And as the candles gutter lower, you realise you've been walking through more than one palace. This Hall of Whispers is not a single building, but a metaphorical corridor, stitched together from centuries of royal secrets. At every turn, another dynasty has its story, another hidden cradle, another shadow cast across the crown. Your eyes grow heavy, and the rhythm of your steps slows. The hall seems endless, but you know that soon you'll emerge into the specific chambers of Spain, England, France, Russia, and beyond. For now, though, you linger here, in the introduction, the place where all stories of royal fragility converge, waiting for the first door to creak open. The whispers fade, replaced by the crackle of dying candles. You stand still, listening, knowing that every secret sealed behind these doors will one day leak out into history. And as the last flame trembles, you realise something simple yet chilling. Dynasties can rise or fall on the strength of a single breath in a cradle. You slip deeper into the candlelit corridor and the air thickens with incense. Ahead, a heavy oak door groans open by itself, and beyond it lies Spain, its palaces sprawling like gilded labyrinths, its portraits looming in gilded frames, and its dynastic line plagued by whispers that refuse to die. You step inside, and at once the whispers grow sharper, clearer, like bees circling honey. The word that hovers most often is Habsburg. You know the name, it clings to history like ivy, binding together half of Europe, from Vienna to Madrid, from the Low Countries to the New World. But tonight, you're not tracing maps or borders. You're slipping into the shadow of Spain's succession, where the gilded crown itself trembled on the heads of fragile heirs. Your bare feet brush across tiles patterned in blue and gold, each echo sounding like a heartbeat. Courtiers line the walls, their ruffled collars fanning out like white halos, their eyes darting nervously toward the nursery doors. They are waiting, always waiting, for a child to grow strong to carry the empire forward. Yet time and again, Spain's hopes are bound to children born delicate, with features that today we might recognise as chromosomal. Back then, they called it destiny, or divine will, or, if they were braver than most, the curse of inbreeding. You pass beneath a ceiling painted with angels, their eyes too wide, their wings smudged by centuries of candle smoke. Beneath them stands a cradle draped in crimson silk. A nurse hums, rocking gently, but her face tells you the truth. This infant will not rule long. Here, in the Spain of the 16th and 17th centuries, the survival of empires sat upon fragile shoulders. The Habsburg dynasty, intent on preserving its bloodline, practiced a dangerous habit, marrying cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, until the family tree looked less like a branching oak and more like a tightly wound knot. A mainstream historical fact falls into your lap like a heavy coin. By the time of Charles II of Spain, the infamous bewitched king, generations of close marriage had left their mark so deeply that he was sterile, sickly, and mentally impaired. His jaw, famously protruding in the so-called Habsburg chin, symbolised the price of dynastic obsession. Historians still argue whether Charles II displayed signs of Down syndrome specifically, or whether his ailments were a broader cocktail of genetic consequences. What is certain is that Spain's succession spiralled into chaos because of his frailty. You lean against a cold column and watch the drama unfold. Imagine being a courtier in Madrid, the bells of the cathedral tolling, while behind palace walls the king, barely able to walk without assistance, clings desperately to life. Every sigh of his fragile lungs echoed in markets and taverns, because without an heir, the Spanish Empire's future was uncertain. The War of Spanish Succession loomed over Europe like storm clouds, and all of it traced back to the fragility of one man. But before Charles II, there were others. The whispers guide you backward in time through tapestries and winding staircases to earlier heirs. Infant and infantas who never reached maturity, whose delicate smiles were painted in oils but quickly erased by death. A fringe tidbit floats into your ear. In the Alcazar of Madrid, one chronicler hinted that portraits of angelic children were quietly hidden away when their features drew too much gossip. Some courtiers claimed that artists were told to alter faces, softening slanted eyes or round cheeks to make them look more regal. Picture that history itself retouched by brushstrokes, as if reality could be painted away. The nursery door creaks, and you slip inside. The room smells of roses and damp linen. A queen, pale, exhausted from childbirth, whispers prayers to a jewelled crucifix. She dares not say aloud what she fears, that her child will not survive the winter. Outside, Spain's empire stretches across oceans, gold and silver pouring in from the Americas, soldiers marching in Flanders, priests preaching in Manila. But here, the empire narrows to one fragile crib. Isn't it absurd? You almost laugh, a dry joke in your throat. Half the world conquered, yet undone by the weakness of a baby's heartbeat. There's another historical fact that tightens the mood. Spain's obsession with pure Habsburg blood meant that between 1516 and 1700, out of 11 marriages, 9 were between close relatives. This wasn't just romance gone wrong, it was strategy sharpened to the point of self-destruction. Historians still debate whether the dynasty might have survived longer had they risked alliances outside the family. But pride is a stubborn thing. For the Habsburgs, to marry outside was to dilute their claim to divinely ordained rule. As you listen to the drip of wax on the chapel floor, you picture Charles II again. The king who could barely chew his food because his jaw was so malformed, who struggled to speak, who spent much of his reign as a ghost haunting his own palace. And yet he was adored, in a strange way, because his very fragility was seen as saintly. One priest whispered that Charles was kept alive only by the hand of God. Imagine that. Your weaknesses turned into proof of divine favour, while your empire collapsed around you. The hall grows darker, the air cooler. You find yourself moving through cloisters where monks shuffle with candles, praying for heirs to live. They record births and deaths in neat Latin script, but between the lines lies the unspoken truth. Too many princes died too soon, too many princesses were hidden away, and always the whisper of a curse. A quirky tidbit drifts into your ear. Some Spanish midwives believed that tying a red ribbon around a newborn's wrist would ward off frailty. In the palaces, silk threads were woven into the layette, tiny charms pinned beneath pillows. You can almost picture the absurdity. While kings plotted wars and popes signed bulls, someone in the nursery was muttering spells over a baby's cradle, hoping to trick fate. Your steps take you into a throne room, where the chair sits empty, its velvet faded, its gilded lions dull with dust. Succession faltered not once, but again and again because heirs could not survive. Each time the court rallied around another child, placing crowns upon heads too fragile to bear them. Imagine the weight of that crown, heavy as destiny, pressing down on a child who couldn't even walk. And here comes your second gentle joke of the night. You can almost imagine the council scribbling on parchment. Plan A, hope the king's son survives. Plan B, panic. That was the entire strategy. Not very sophisticated, was it? Yet the tragedy is real. When Charles II died in 1700, childless and broken, Spain plunged into the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that dragged in France, Austria, Britain, and beyond. Millions suffered because a fragile man could not leave behind an heir, all the gold of the Americas, all the power of the Armada, and yet one body's frailty toppled the dynasty. That's the curse in its purest form. You turn away from the throne and step into a side gallery. Portraits of infantas stare down at you, their faces sweet but solemn. Were they touched by the same fragility? Some chroniclers hint that certain daughters of the Habsburg line displayed signs of developmental delays, but records are hushed, ambiguous. Historians still argue whether these hints were real, or whether they were whispers spread by rivals eager to smear the dynasty's reputation. Truth and rumour intertwine like vines, and you, walking these halls, cannot untangle them fully. The air smells faintly of oranges, brought in from Andalusian groves. Outside, the city of Madrid buzzes, but in here the silence is heavy. You realise something chilling. In the end, the Habsburgs' obsession with purity ensured their extinction in Spain. Charles II was the last of his line, and the crown passed to the Bourbons. It was as though history itself sighed in relief, saying, "Enough." But as you turn to leave the Spanish hall, one last whisper catches you. Some say that Charles II, on his deathbed, believed himself bewitched, that witches had cursed him, stolen his strength, left him barren. He ordered exorcisms, holy relics, endless prayers. Picture it, a king of vast empire reduced to lying in bed, begging priests to lift a curse that was really just his own bloodline catching up with him. You shake your head, a grim smile forming. If only someone had told him about chromosomes. And so, night owl, you slip back toward the corridor. Behind you, Spain's shadowed succession fades into silence, leaving only the echo of fragile cradles and empty thrones. Ahead lies another door, another dynasty with its own whispers. But the lesson from Spain lingers. The greatest empire in the world undone by something as small and silent as a gene. The corridor tilts, and suddenly the air smells of damp stone, roast meats, and the sharp tang of ink scratched onto parchment. You've stepped into England, the Tudor court specifically, where rumour is as thick as the tapestries that line the halls. Candles flicker against oak-panelled walls, casting long shadows across the faces of courtiers who are far too interested in who sits in the nursery. You're about to hear a story that rarely makes it into school textbooks, one whispered across centuries, that Henry VIII, the king of 6 wives and endless appetite, may have fathered a child who never wore the crown, not because of treachery or scandal, but because the child's body carried a silent difference. The Tudor dynasty thrived on appearances. Everything, from the width of a ruff to the angle of a jousting lance, was a performance. But beneath the surface, things were fragile. Henry VIII needed sons the way a gambler needs dice, rolling again and again, desperate for the right outcome. He buried infant children, mourned miscarriages, and divorced or executed wives in pursuit of a male heir. it's no stretch to imagine that somewhere in that storm of births and losses, one child may have come into the world with what we today recognise as Down syndrome. Your bare feet slide across rush-strewn floors, and you picture a candlelit birthing chamber. Midwives bustle, priests hover, and courtiers pretend not to listen through the heavy door. The Queen, or perhaps one of Henry's mistresses, cries out, and then silence falls. A baby is born, swaddled, but the whispers begin almost immediately. Delicate, slow, touched. In Tudor language, these words carried heavy meaning. A mainstream historical fact anchors this scene. Henry VIII's desperation for a healthy son was not paranoia, it was policy. The Wars of the Roses had torn England apart barely a generation earlier, and without a secure male heir, civil war could flare again. Every infant's cry echoed like a trumpet blast in the realm's politics. You can almost hear the court clerks sharpening their quills, ready to record the birth of another prince, only to pause when they see the infant's slack features or weak limbs. Now here's the fringe tidbit. Some scholars have pointed out that records of unfit or infirm Tudor infants vanish almost too conveniently. A few tantalising references survive, cryptic notes about children who died shortly after birth, or whose names were never formally entered into the line of succession. One rumour insists that Henry's court quietly buried an infant boy in secret, somewhere near Greenwich, a child who had not died immediately, but was deemed too weak, too unsuitable to live in the line of sight. Was this the so-called Tudor cradle unearthed? We cannot prove it, but the silence around it is suspicious in itself. Historians still argue whether the rumour of such a child is true, or whether it was political slander spread by Henry's enemies. After all, if you wanted to undermine the king's legitimacy, nothing was juicier than whispering that his bloodline was tainted with weakness. Imagine rival nobles smirking over goblets of wine, murmuring, "The king's son is no warrior. He's fit only for cloisters." Whether fact or fiction the rumour endured, seeping into the cracks of Tudor mythology. You press your hand to a tapestry, feeling the rough wool beneath your fingertips. The scene woven there is one of triumph. A hunt, a stag brought down, dogs barking. But behind it you imagine a smaller hidden chamber, where a fragile infant might have been rocked in silence, guarded not for security, but for secrecy. The Tudor court was skilled in both pageantry and concealment. If a child was born with a difference, the safest path, for the dynasty, not for the child, was erasure. Picture Henry VIII himself, a man larger than life, bursting with ambition, his calves displayed proudly in hose, his waistline expanding with each feast. He could order the execution of a wife with a flick of his hand, yet what would he do when faced with a child he could not mould into a warrior prince? It's not hard to imagine his temper flaring, his face reddening, his booming voice demanding silence on the matter. For Henry, the crown was not a fatherly inheritance, but a battlefield prize. A frail child would have been a humiliation, not a blessing. And yet, in your quieter moments of imagining, you see the other side. Perhaps the Queen, or even one of Henry's mistresses, held such a child close, refusing to see shame in the round face, the gentle eyes, the grasping hands. Mothers loved in secret, even when kings ordered silence. It's a tender possibility, one history rarely records, but you can almost hear a lullaby humming faintly, hidden beneath the thunder of Henry's demands. Here's your first joke of the night, slipped gently among the shadows. Imagine the gossip in the Tudor kitchens, where cooks whispered over boiling pots. Well, His Majesty's heir can't even hold a spoon. Shall we set aside the throne too? Dark humour has always been a way to survive in palaces where truth was dangerous to speak plainly. The trail takes you to Westminster Abbey, where stone monuments tower like frozen giants. Somewhere among the countless graves lie infants too young to have stories, their names carved in delicate script. It's a reminder that even royal cradles were fragile, their occupants fleeting. Some historians speculate that more Tudor infants died, or were hidden, than the official record admits. The absence itself is suspicious, like missing pages from a book. A quirky tidbit floats up. One Tudor chronicler described a child in Henry's household as blessed with heavenly calm. At first glance it sounds poetic, but those who read between the lines suggest that this was code for a child with developmental delays, perhaps kept away from the rough and tumble games of court life. Was this Henry's child? or another royal relation brushed aside? The chronicler leaves us no clear answers, only the kind of ambiguity that keeps you awake at night. Historians still argue whether this so-called hidden heir could have influenced later paranoia in the dynasty. Consider this. Elizabeth I, Henry's daughter, grew up knowing her father had obsessed over heirs. Did whispers of fragile siblings linger in her mind as she resisted marriage herself? The connections are tenuous, but history often operates in shadows, not certainties. You wander further into the palace, where suits of armour gleam in the torchlight. Some are built for children, ceremonial miniatures meant to display dynastic pride. One small breastplate, never worn, catches your eye. Was it crafted for a prince who never lived long enough, or never lived visibly enough, to wear it? The thought chills you. Armour forged in hope, left to rust in silence. Here's another joke to keep your eyelids from drooping. Imagine the poor armourer sweating over his forge, finally presenting the tiny suit of armour, only to be told, "Ah yes, about that child. We don't talk about him anymore." That's Tudor efficiency for you. Spend the gold, erase the heir, move on. The reality beneath the jokes is stark. The Tudor line, for all its grandeur, was perpetually at risk of collapsing. Henry VIII's obsession with heirs came not from vanity but from real fear. Without strong successors, the crown could tumble back into civil war. A frail or hidden child was not just a private sorrow, but a national threat. And so, silence became the solution. You hear the scratch of quills in a distant chamber, clerks recording laws, edicts, proclamations. Not one of them writes openly of a disabled heir, but the absences in their ledgers speak louder than words. This is how power preserves itself, by omission, by burying not just bodies but truths. As you drift toward the end of this Tudor passage, the air grows cooler, the whispers softer. You realise you've walked not through proof, but through rumour, through hints woven into silence, and yet the silence itself tells a story. Somewhere in England's royal nurseries, perhaps at Greenwich, perhaps in the Tower, there may once have been a cradle that held a child born with Down syndrome, a child erased from memory to protect a dynasty. The candles flicker, and you almost hear the lullaby again, soft, persistent, against the hush of politics. The Tudor cradle, unearthed not by archaeologists but by whispers, still rocks in the shadows of history, and you, night owl, have brushed against its veil. You slip into another gallery of shadows, and this time the tapestries are woven with fleur-de-lis. The air smells faintly of beeswax and musk, the perfume of powdered wigs and velvet doublets. You are in France now, where the Bourbon dynasty reigned with grandeur, but where the splendour of Versailles could not mask fragile truths hidden in nurseries and whispered through gilded corridors. France's kings adored pageantry, but succession here was just as precarious as anywhere else. And when an heir showed signs of frailty, the gossip was no less ruthless. Your feet glide over marble floors, echoing through vast salons where crystal chandeliers sway slightly, their prisms scattering light like droplets of rain. Courtiers cluster in corners, their voices low but their eyes bright with malice. Every dynasty has its secrets, and for the Bourbons, some of those secrets looked suspiciously like children born with differences the court could not explain nor accept. A mainstream historical fact sets the stage. The French monarchy's survival relied heavily on the production of a male heir, known as the Dauphin. In 1711, the Grand Dauphin, son of Louis XIV, died unexpectedly of smallpox. But the real sorrow lay in the generation beneath him, where his son, the Duke of Burgundy, also died soon after, leaving behind frail children. By 1715, when Louis XIV himself passed, only a sickly 5-year-old great-grandson was left to inherit the throne as Louis XV. You can almost feel the tension buzzing like static in Versailles, an empire built on spectacle, but its future balanced on the breath of a fragile child. Imagine yourself as a fly on the gilded walls of Versailles. The court is feasting, powdered faces laughing under candlelight, but beneath the clinking of glasses lies dread. The Dauphin coughs too often. His colour is pale. Some say his features look different. In an age before diagnosis, a round face or slower development could spark rumour that the child was angelic, blessed, or, more cruelly, unsuited for rule. Historians still argue whether some of these recorded ailments were Down syndrome, tuberculosis, or a blend of conditions, but the ambiguity itself shows how fragile royal blood could be. You drift into the Queen's apartments, where gilded cribs stand beneath canopies of silk. The air is heavy with rosewater sprinkled to mask sickness. Maids rock infants while whispering prayers. Here, appearances mean everything. If a child lags in speech, or toddles unsteadily beyond the usual age, the ladies-in-waiting exchange knowing glances. Yet they dare not speak openly, for to question the air is to question the crown itself. A quirky tidbit enters your ear like a mischievous moth. In Louis XIV's time, some courtiers believed that placing a frog in a child's cradle could cure weakness of the limbs. Picture it, a tiny prince lying beside a squirming amphibian, all in the name of royal health. You chuckle softly, the absurdity of superstition woven into the grandeur of Versailles. Frog therapy didn't work, of course, but it reveals the desperation of parents who could not admit their child was simply born different. Your steps carry you into the Hall of Mirrors, where sunlight streams through towering windows and reflects endlessly in glass. It feels infinite, this gallery of self-regard, but imagine how terrifying it must have been for a child of fragile body or mind to be paraded here. Every imperfection was magnified, every hesitation scrutinized. In such a hall there was no hiding weakness. The mirrors reflected not just beauty but fear. One gentle joke hovers at your lips. You can almost imagine courtiers whispering, "If the Dauphin looks ill in one mirror, just stand him at a different angle. Perhaps in the next reflection he'll seem stronger." That's Versailles logic. If reality doesn't fit, adjust the presentation. The reality, though, was grim. Fragile heirs often did not survive, and their deaths sparked political crises. Take Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette's children, for instance. Their son, Louis-Joseph, the first Dauphin, was frail from birth, plagued with health problems that some suggest were skeletal deformities. He died at just 7 years old. The younger son, Louis Charles, briefly became Louis XVII in the Revolution's darkest days, but his imprisonment and mysterious illness ensured he never ruled. Here again, whispers cling. Some revolutionaries claimed the boy had disabilities, others said he was perfectly healthy but abused in captivity. Historians still debate, the record tangled by propaganda. You find yourself moving into a darker corner of the palace, where the furniture is less ornate, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken grief. In this chamber, mothers wept for children lost not to assassins or guillotines, but to frailty. It is one of history's crueler ironies that empires, commanding armies and riches, could be undone by a cough in the nursery. Another fringe tidbit. One court physician to Louis XV recorded in his notes that a royal child was gentle of spirit but slow of understanding. The wording is vague, but modern readers suspect he was describing developmental delays. Was this a veiled reference to Down syndrome? We cannot say with certainty, but it shows how carefully physicians chose their words, aware that too blunt a description could cost them their careers or their heads. Historians still argue whether the Bourbons' supposed curse of heirs was the result of genetic fragility, environmental disease, or sheer bad luck. The truth likely lies in a mix, but the result was the same. The court lived in fear of children who could not fulfill the role destiny demanded. As you pass under carved cherubs, you hear a lullaby sung in French, sweet and sad. The words promise the child he will one day wear a crown, though everyone in the room knows it is unlikely. That is the cruel beauty of Bourbon succession. Hope and denial danced hand in hand. And here comes your second joke of the night. Imagine the courtiers updating their betting books. Odds on the Dauphin surviving the winter, 5-1. Odds on France collapsing if he doesn't. Even money-morbid humour, but it kept the gamblers sane in a palace where life and death were entertainment. The revolution looms at the edges of your vision now. You see the guillotine's shadow falling across the palace floors and realise that fragile heirs played their part in France's collapse. Louis XVI's inability to produce a healthy, visible heir added fuel to the fire of public discontent. People mocked the monarchy not just for excess, but for weakness. Rumours of frail children became political weapons sharpened into satire. You step out into the gardens of Versailles, where fountains spray and hedges stretch in perfect symmetry. But even here, where everything is controlled, you sense the chaos beneath. Fragile heirs meant fragile alliances, and fragile alliances meant revolution waiting to pounce. Your final tidbit in this French passage: one revolutionary pamphlet cruelly claimed that the Dauphin was fit only for the convent, not the throne, mocking his rumoured slowness. Whether true or not, such words eroded public faith in monarchy. In the end, it didn't matter whether the children of the Bourbons had Down syndrome, tuberculosis, or nothing at all. What mattered was perception, and perception in politics is often deadlier than truth. As you leave Versailles behind, you look once more into the Hall of Mirrors. The chandeliers flicker, the mirrors reflect your shadow, and you realise the Bourbon dynasty itself was like this room, magnificent on the surface, but fragile within, every weakness multiplied 1,000-fold. Hearts broke, heirs died, and the curse whispered on. The corridor bends again, and this time you emerge into a world softened by candlelight, but heavy with the smell of incense and varnish. Vienna rises around you, grand palaces set against the distant hush of the Danube, a city forever humming with music and intrigue. You're inside the Habsburg court now, Austria's heart, where painted cherubs peer down from frescoed ceilings, and every hall seems designed to overwhelm the senses. Yet beneath the grandeur lies a hush, a silence broken only by the whispers of nannies, the shuffle of priests, and the sighs of mothers who knew their infants might never see adulthood. Welcome to Austria's haunted nursery, where too many royal cradles stood empty too soon. Your bare feet press into parquet floors polished so brightly they reflect the flicker of every candle. Portraits of emperors and empresses line the gallery, their features stiff and proud. But it is not the emperors who matter tonight. It is the children, the ones born into the dynasty with round faces, fragile frames, or slow development, who quickly became subjects of rumour. The Habsburgs ruled vast lands, but they could not rule their own blood. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. The Austrian branch of the Habsburg family was notorious for its genetic difficulties, especially the infamous Habsburg jaw, the result of generations of intermarriage. Jaw deformities, epilepsy, and fertility problems plagued the line. But alongside these, records of infirm or slow children pepper the family history. And though never described directly, some modern scholars have wondered if a handful of these forgotten heirs might have lived with what we now recognise as Down syndrome. The nursery in Vienna's Hofburg Palace was not like any ordinary nursery. It smelled of beeswax, holy water, and the faint sweetness of sugared almonds left as charms. Cribs draped in silk stood beside gilded icons, and nurses in stiff uniforms whispered prayers more often than lullabies. You step close to one such cradle in your imagination, and see an infant whose features stand out. Almond-shaped eyes, a small mouth, a gentleness that unsettled a court obsessed with strength. In another world, this child might have been cherished, but here the whisper is always the same: not fit for rule. Here's your first fringe tidbit. The imperial court had an official master of the nursery, a man whose job it was to report on the health of heirs with near-scientific precision. His records, however, sometimes dip into vague phrases like child of delicate constitution or gifted with calm disposition. Modern historians still argue whether those were polite codes for developmental disabilities. The ambiguity itself makes you lean closer, straining to hear through the centuries. The chamber grows cooler, and you hear the faint notes of a harpsichord drifting in from another hall. Austria was music's beating heart: Mozart, Haydn, Schubert. And you can almost imagine a fragile child listening to those notes, eyes wide, hands clapping slowly in delight. Perhaps music was their only real solace, even as the court fretted over their inability to fulfill dynastic roles. You drift past a tapestry depicting a hunt. Men on horseback charge boars with spears, dogs barking at their heels. It's an image of vigour, masculinity, triumph. Yet right behind the wall where such a tapestry might have hung, a frail infant would have lain swaddled, unable to crawl, let alone charge. The contrast between image and reality is almost comical, if it weren't so tragic. And speaking of comedy, here's your first light joke of the section. You can almost picture a courtier writing in his diary. The emperor's heir does not yet speak, but he listens most attentively to birds. Perhaps we should appoint him Minister of Songbirds. Sarcasm has always been a refuge, even in gilded halls. A mainstream fact pierces the candlelit haze again. Empress Maria Theresa, one of Austria's most formidable rulers, bore 16 children. Several of them died in infancy, and at least 2 were described in court records as weak in body and mind. Historians debate whether any displayed signs of Down syndrome, but the possibility haunts the family tree. Maria Theresa, pragmatic and devout, insisted on baptizing every child immediately after birth, aware that survival was never guaranteed. One quirky tidbit drifts in. Midwives in Vienna sometimes place tiny relics of saints beneath pillows to ward off illness. Imagine a fragile infant sleeping with a splinter of bone from saint, Stephen tucked under the mattress, while nurses whispered chants in Latin. To us, it feels eerie. To them, it was a desperate hope. The shadows lengthen as you walk deeper into the Hofburg's imagined nursery. You see a little chair carved from walnut never sat in. A miniature set of armour, commissioned in advance, sits unused in a corner. The silence is heavier here than in Versailles or Madrid, as if Austria specialised not in pageantry but in erasure. Rather than parade fragile heirs, they were simply absorbed into silence, their names mentioned only in passing footnotes of genealogy charts. Historians still argue whether these silences were deliberate concealments or simply losses too painful to record in detail. After all, the mortality rate among infants was high across Europe, royal or not. But the peculiar vagueness of Austrian records, the reluctance to specify causes of weakness, raises suspicions. When so much else in the dynasty was catalogued with precision, why the evasions here? Another candle flickers low, and in its light you glimpse Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi, in her later years, walking through gardens mourning her murdered son Rudolf. While not linked to Down syndrome, Rudolf's suicide in 1889 only deepened the family's reputation for tragedy. You realise the nursery's ghosts stretch beyond infancy. Fragility in body or mind was woven into the dynasty's fabric, generation after generation. Your second joke sneaks in softly. Imagine a Habsburg uncle muttering, "Our family tree has fewer branches than a broomstick and it sweeps away our heirs just as fast." Grim humour, but a fair point. Back in the nursery, you sense the desperation of nurses trying to coax milestones, clapping hands, first steps, first words, from children who struggled. Some may have thrived quietly, never intended for thrones, hidden in convents or monasteries where gentler rhythms of life suited them better. There are hints, whispers of Habsburg daughters who never married but lived long, cloistered lives, perhaps because their conditions made them unsuitable for dynastic marriage markets. And here comes the third required flavour of humour. Picture a confessor, exasperated, whispering during a baptism, "Dear Lord, perhaps next time send the family a healthy child. We are running out of candles." You smile despite yourself, because sometimes the only response to relentless sorrow is weary irony. The bells of Vienna toll faintly in your imagination, and you sense the empire beyond. The armies drilling, the diplomats scheming, the composers composing. Yet inside the palace walls, all of that might be undermined by one child's frailty. That was Austria's haunted nursery, the place where political futures faltered before they even began. As you turn to leave, you glance back at the cradles. Some are empty, some hold shadows, but all hum with silence. The hush is not peaceful, it is heavy, burdened with secrets the dynasty dared not speak aloud. And you, night owl, are left with the unsettling knowledge that history's grandest empires were undone not only by wars and revolutions, but by the softest, quietest cries in gilded nurseries. The corridor chills beneath your feet, and the candles sputter as though the cold itself has blown in from beyond the palace walls. You have stepped into Russia now, where stone fortresses rise from frozen rivers and onion domes glisten under perpetual snow. Here, the Romanovs ruled with iron and gold, yet even their glittering dynasty bore secrets hushed in nursery chambers. You drift across a floor tiled with icy blue mosaics, each echo muffled by thick furs thrown across the hall. The silence here is deeper, as though centuries of frost have preserved it. You're about to listen in on Russia's snowbound secret. Royal children hidden away in palaces and monasteries, their lives obscured by orthodox ritual and dynastic pride. Picture Moscow in the 17th century. The Kremlin towers loom like jagged teeth against a winter sky. Inside, the air's warm with burning pine, the scent thick enough to sting your eyes. Courtiers in long caftans shuffle through corridors, bowing low before icons. In this world, a prince was not just a child, but a living embodiment of divine favour. To admit weakness in an heir was not only politically dangerous, it was spiritually terrifying. And so, when a child was born with differences, whispers became prayers, and prayers became silences. A mainstream historical fact sets your footing. The Romanov dynasty itself began in 1613 with Michael I, chosen after the time of troubles partly because the previous Rurikid line had collapsed in a tangle of disputed successions and fragile heirs. That collapse had been accelerated by the death of Tsarevich Dmitry, the last son of Ivan the Terrible, who was epileptic and possibly developmentally delayed. His suspicious death in Uglitch at age 8 left Russia scrambling for legitimacy. Historians still argue whether Dmitry truly died of seizure complications, assassination, or a self-inflicted accident with a knife. Yet his condition, clearly noted by contemporaries, was seen as a divine sign that he could not rule. Russia's first great succession crisis was sparked not only by politics, but by the frailty of a child's body. Step closer to a nursery in the Kremlin, where icons glitter in gold leaf above the crib. A nurse rocks an infant wrapped in sable-lined swaddling, whispering orthodox prayers under her breath. The child's face, round and soft, does not meet the milestones expected of an heir. Courtiers frown, priests cross themselves, you sense the unease. Is this a blessing or a curse? In a culture where holy fools, Eurodivi, were sometimes revered for their innocence, a child with disabilities could be cast in an ambiguous light. Some might claim the child was closer to God. Others muttered that he was unfit to lead armies against the Tartars or the Poles. Here's a fringe tidbit that drifts like snowflakes into your ear. In 17th century Russia, fragile royal children were sometimes hidden in convents under the guise of piety. Officially, they had chosen a life devoted to God. Unofficially, it was a way to erase them quietly from the line of succession. A young princess with a gentle, unworldly demeanour might be praised as saintly, when in truth she simply could not play the political game. The snow outside thickens, muffling the bells of Moscow. You walk through another chamber where walls are painted with saints whose eyes follow you solemnly. In this holy glow, the weight of secrecy is even heavier. To speak too loudly of an unfit heir would be treasonous, and so the stories trickled out only in rumours, passed from nursemaids to kitchen boys, from monks to wandering pilgrims. Your first gentle joke comes like a puff of frosty breath. Imagine a Russian courtier scribbling in his diary. The Tsarevich does not speak, but he stares most earnestly at icons. Perhaps he is already more devout than the patriarch. A wry smile flickers. You can sense the mix of sarcasm and reverence that defined Russian attitudes toward fragility. Step forward in time to the reign of Peter the Great. He looms in history as a towering reformer, dragging Russia into modernity with sheer force of will. But even in his line, the snowbound secret whispers. His son, Tsarevich Alexei, was accused not of disability but of weakness, of lacking the vigour his father demanded. Alexei's slow, hesitant manner was ridiculed, and Peter condemned him to death for treason. Yet among the whispers, some suggest Alexei's demeanour might have been coloured by unrecorded developmental struggles. Historians still argue whether Peter's cruelty stemmed from political fear or genuine disappointment at a son who could not match his energy. Either way, Russia's succession was haunted again by questions of fitness. A quirky tidbit wafts in from the frozen edges. Some Russian midwives believed that sprinkling newborns with snow would toughen them, preventing frailty. Imagine a tiny Grand Duke, freshly baptized, suddenly doused in ice while nurses muttered blessings. You shiver at the thought. Orthodox baptism meets Siberian endurance training. It's absurd, yet it reveals the desperate lengths to which families went to banish weakness. Now picture the late 19th century. The Romanovs sit atop a fragile empire. Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra finally produce a long-awaited son, Alexei, in 1904. His illness, haemophilia, is well known. But alongside that, rumours swirled of his delayed development, his fragility, his constant exhaustion. While haemophilia is well documented, some modern whispers suggest he may have exhibited additional traits of disability, though cloaked by the far greater drama of his bleeding disorder. Regardless, his vulnerability drew Rasputin into the palace, entangling mysticism, politics, and desperation. Once again, the empire's fate balanced on a child's fragile body. Historians still argue whether Rasputin's influence could have been so profound had Alexei been robust. Would the monarchy have collapsed so quickly if the heir had been strong? Or was the revolution inevitable regardless? These debates hang in the icy air like mist. What is undeniable is that the secrecy around Alexei's condition mirrored centuries of hush surrounding Russia's snowbound heirs. The dynasty feared transparency more than illness itself. You wander into a dim chapel, its walls blackened by centuries of candle smoke. Here you imagine fragile children laid to rest, their names recorded only in the terse lines of Orthodox liturgy. Bells toll above you, slow and mournful. Each peal sounds like a dynasty sighing under the weight of fragile succession. Your second joke of the night shimmers like frost. Picture the Kremlin Council drafting contingency plans. Plan A, pray the Tsarevich survives. Plan B, pray harder. Plan C, invent more saints if necessary. It's both grim and comical. Russia's mighty empire strategizing around the whims of fate. The snow crunches beneath your imagined steps as you move through palace gardens, barren in winter. You realise Russia's dynastic story was shaped as much by what was hidden as by what was shown. Fragile children were cloaked in holiness, sent to monasteries, or erased from chronicles, but their absence distorted history's arc. Wars were fought, reforms imposed, revolutions sparked, all because the line of succession faltered under the weight of secrecy. A final quirky detail before you leave this frozen corridor. One legend insists that a hidden Romanov princess, described only as blessed but simple, lived her entire life cloistered in a convent near Novgorod, cherished by nuns but erased from dynastic records. No proof survives, only the ghost of rumour, but her story lingers as one more snowbound secret in an empire built on silences. And so, night owl, you step out of the Kremlin shadow. Snowflakes brush your cheeks, the river glitters faintly in the moonlight, and the bells toll again. Russia's snowbound secret is not one child, but a pattern. Fragile heirs hidden behind icon screens, erased by silence, their frailty reshaping dynasties in ways no sword ever could. You step away from the frozen towers of Moscow, and the corridor softens under your feet. The frost gives way to warm oak beams, tapestries stitched with alpine flowers, and the faint buttery smell of pretzels wafting in from some imagined courtyard. You have entered Bavaria, the patchwork of duchies and electorates nestled within the Holy Roman Empire, later the Kingdom of Bavaria itself. This is a place of beer halls and baroque palaces, of music and monasteries. But tonight, you're not here for the brass bands or the rococo ceilings. You're here for the cradles, the fragile infants who were meant to wear crowns, yet never did. You're here for Bavaria's crown, unworn. The Wittelsbach dynasty, Bavaria's ruling family, lasted for centuries, a line proud of its endurance through wars, shifting alliances, and the constant seesaw of imperial politics. But that pride often masked fragility. If Spain's Habsburgs are remembered for their infamous jaw, Bavaria's Wittelsbachs are remembered in part for their bouts of instability and hidden heirs, whose health raised hushed eyebrows. The Bavarian succession, though less globally dramatic than Spain or France, was no less haunted by children born too frail to claim their inheritance. A mainstream historical fact sets your footing. The Wittelsbachs had their fair share of rulers troubled by health issues. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, known as the fairy tale king, was declared insane and deposed in 1886 before mysteriously dying days later. His brother, Otto, was officially king after him, but was mentally unfit to rule and spent his reign confined under guardianship. While these later figures were not linked specifically to Down syndrome, their stories reveal a dynasty with a legacy of fragile heirs. And behind those famous names lie quieter, forgotten children whose fragility was even more profound. Imagine stepping into the residence palace in Munich. Marble floors echo beneath your bare feet, and gilded ceilings glow above. In the nursery, cribs draped in lace stand like little thrones waiting for their occupants. But in one cradle lies an infant whose development seems slower, whose features are softer, whose gaze lingers not on the glittering toys of gold but on the flickering shadows of candlelight. Courtiers murmur that the child is a gentle soul, but behind their words lurks disappointment. Bavaria, like every dynasty, needed strong heirs. A fragile one was a dynastic liability. Here's a fringe tidbit. In Bavarian folklore, children born with differences were sometimes called Wechselbalg, changelings swapped by fairies. While peasants whispered this superstition in villages, imagine how it sounded in a royal palace when a duke's child was described as such. The story could never be spoken openly, but perhaps a wet nurse or a servant muttered it under her breath. Fearing that fate itself had tricked the royal bloodline, you wander deeper and you hear the faint notes of music. Bavaria was a land of composers, where Mozart's operas were beloved and Wagner found patronage. It's easy to picture a fragile Bavarian air soothed not by politics or pageantry, but by music drifting through the palace halls. Perhaps a child with developmental differences clapped happily to a tune in ways the court found both endearing and unsettling. Historians still argue whether some unnamed Bavarian princes recorded as unsuitable or sickly in genealogies were in fact children with chromosomal differences. Records from the 16th and 17th centuries are vague. One child described as without vigour, another as a lamb of mind. The language is elusive, as if scribes deliberately blurred the truth. It is this vagueness, the refusal to say plainly, that leaves us wandering in the haunted nursery of rumour. Your first joke of the night flutters into the candlelight. Imagine a Bavarian courtier sighing. We've built castles that float on lakes, but heaven forbid we build a healthy family tree. It's weary sarcasm, that you sense the truth in it. Dynasties built fairy tale palaces while ignoring the frailties rocking in their nurseries. The air grows heavier as you picture a tiny funeral procession winding through Munich's cobbled streets. A white coffin no bigger than a cradle carried toward a church. Bells toll, mourners cross themselves, and yet the court records reduce the child to a single line. Died young. No cause, no detail, only silence. You realise this is how history swallows fragile heirs, not with fanfare, but with a mission. Here's a quirky tidbit to lighten the air. In Bavaria, nurses sometimes hung garlic cloves over the cribs of infants to ward off illness. Picture a golden cradle, gilded lions at its corners, draped in lace, and above it, a pungent string of garlic swinging gently. Even royalty turned to peasant remedies when fear gnawed at them. You drift onward through the palace corridors. Paintings of hunts line the walls, stags, hounds, hunters triumphant. These images of vigour contrast sharply with the reality of heirs too delicate to ride horses or wield swords. In one painting, a young prince appears beside his father, painted stronger than he truly was. The brush smoothed away his fragility, just as Spanish artists once did. Art became a mask, concealing the crown unworn. Historians still argue whether Ludwig II's mental instability had roots in generations of hereditary fragility, whether there was a hidden genetic thread linking the dynasty's struggles. But what seems undeniable is the pattern. Bavaria's rulers often found themselves with heirs too fragile to fulfill dynastic ambitions. Whether hidden in monasteries or quietly erased, these children haunt the line like ghosts. Your second joke shuffles forward, soft as felt on a beer hall floor. Imagine the councillors of Bavaria, tankards in hand, muttering, "We're excellent at brewing strong ale, but terrible at brewing strong airs." It's grim, but you can almost hear the clinking of steins echoing the truth. A mainstream fact returns to anchor you. The Wittelsbach dynasty, for all its power, ultimately lost its throne in 1918. The monarchy collapsed not because of fragile heirs alone, but because of war and revolution. Yet the dynasty's history is threaded with the fragility of its rulers, from Otto's mental incapacity to the rumoured hidden children of earlier centuries. Fragility was part of its identity, a shadow beneath the Bavarian crown. You pass through a chapel now, where votive candles flicker against stone walls. Here lie the tiny coffins of infants, their names carved faintly, their stories erased. The hush is thick, broken only by whispered prayers in Latin. You realise that in Bavaria, as in Spain, France, Austria and Russia, fragile heirs were folded into the silence of religion. Better to entrust their souls to God than admit their frailty to politics. Your third joke slips in like a monk's whisper. Imagine the abbot of a monastery tasked with raising a hidden royal child, muttering, "Another prince too delicate for court? At this rate, we'll need a new wing just for blue-blooded novices." The humour is dry, but the sadness underneath is unmistakable. As you move toward the exit of this Bavarian gallery, you glance back one last time. The cribs are empty now, the crowns unworn, but the shadows of fragile children linger in the corners. The dynasty boasted castles like Neuschwanstein, palaces so magical they inspired fairy tales. Yet in the real fairy tale, the crown often slipped from fragile heads before it was ever secured. The corridor darkens, and you hear faint echoes of church bells from Munich's Frauenkirche. The sound fades as you step forward, carrying with you the image of crowns unworn, of heirs erased, of a dynasty haunted by fragility that architecture and beer could never disguise. The air grows brisk again as you walk further down the corridor, the Bavarian echoes of garlic-scented nurseries giving way to the damp, smoky breath of Tudor and Stuart England. The wooden panels here are darker, the ceilings lower and the corridors narrower. Candle smoke stains the beams, and the faint smell of tallow clings to the rushes on the floor. You can almost hear the scurrying of rats behind the walls, and above it all the steady murmur of voices, whispers passed from servant to servant, courtier to courtier. This is England's rumour mill, and tonight its subject is fragile children tucked out of sight. England never lacked gossip. If Spain's curses were painted on portraits and Austria's hidden in church records, England's were whispered over ale in taverns, scrawled in pamphlets, and traded in the shadows of palace corridors. Fragile heirs were not merely a private sorrow here, they were fodder for public rumour, twisted into weapons of politics and propaganda. A mainstream historical fact sets the stage. The English monarchy, particularly during the Tudor and Stuart periods, was obsessed with succession. Henry VIII's desperation for a son led to the break with Rome, the birth of the Church of England, and decades of upheaval. Elizabeth I's refusal to marry threw her court into a frenzy of speculation. Later, the Stuarts faced their own crises, with James II's Catholic heir sparking the Glorious Revolution. Every rumour about royal children mattered, because every child could mean the difference between peace and civil war. And yet, some of those rumours were veiled hints about children who never appeared in the public eye. The whispers spoke of infants born infirm, slow, or too delicate, tucked away in country houses or convents. The official chronicle stayed silent, but the rumour mill kept turning. Picture Whitehall Palace in the 17th century. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meat and candle wax. Servants hurry down shadowed passages, carrying trays of venison past painted portraits of monarchs glaring down. In a small chamber near the Queen's apartments a cradle rocks. Inside, perhaps, lies a child with almond-shaped eyes and a round, soft face, hands reaching clumsily for the tassels of the coverlet. The Queen presses a kiss to the child's head, but the nurse's expression is guarded. Out in the hall, a courtier murmurs, "The child is touched." The words ripple like stones thrown into water. Your first fringe tidbit emerges from the gloom. During the reign of James I, rumours circulated that one of his many children was kept from public view due to frailty. While most of James's children are accounted for, Henry Frederick, Charles, Elizabeth, there are hints of infants who lived only briefly, their conditions described vaguely. Some scholars suggest one such child may have shown developmental delays, hushed into silence by courtiers who feared scandal. Historians still argue whether these rumours point to genuine cases of disability, or whether they were political slanders invented by rivals. After all, England was rife with pamphleteers eager to smear royal families with whispers of weakness. If you wanted to undermine a king, you didn't need an army. You only needed a rumour about his heir being unfit. Your first gentle joke of the night slips into the hush. Imagine a pamphlet seller on a London street corner yelling, "Door, hot off the press!" The prince can't walk straight. "Get your copies here!" It's a grim kind of humour, but not far from reality in a city where gossip spread faster than plague. Walk with me now to the court of Charles I, where portraits show a happy brood of royal children. Yet among them, whispers again surface. One child is described as slow to speak, another as gentle beyond his years. Were these simply poetic flourishes, or coded acknowledgements of disability? The line is fine, and the silence around it suspicious. You can almost feel the courtier's unease, how much truth to reveal, how much to disguise in metaphor. A quirky tidbit lightens the air. In some English households, including noble ones, it was common to place a sprig of rosemary under a child's pillow to strengthen memory. Imagine a royal nursery where a fragile heir slept under sheets of silk, with a humble sprig of rosemary tucked beneath his head, as if herbs could guard dynastic destiny. The rumour mill did not stop at the Tudors or Stuarts. Even in the Georgian and Victorian eras, whispers circulated about hidden children. George III, infamous for his bouts of madness, fathered 15 children. Some of them were rumoured to be delicate or simple-minded, though most of these references were buried in private correspondence rather than public record. The Victorian obsession with propriety meant that any deviation from the image of a perfect family was swiftly concealed. Your second joke arrives in a dry murmur. Picture Queen Victoria frowning over a child's slow progress and sighing, "We can manage empires and colonies, but heaven help us if we must manage the nursery." The irony isn't lost. You can sense the same fragility beneath all the pomp. Back in earlier centuries, England's rumour mill turned most viciously during crises. In 1688, James II's Catholic queen gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward. Protestants refused to believe the child was legitimate, whispering instead that he was a sickly impostor smuggled into the Queen's bed in a warming pan. The story was absurd, yet it stuck, fueling the Glorious Revolution. Though this tale was more about politics than disability, it reveals how eagerly the public consumed stories of fragile, illegitimate, or unsuitable heirs. The line between rumour and reality was blurred by the sheer appetite for scandal. Historians still argue whether any English royal children actually had Down syndrome and were deliberately hidden. The evidence is circumstantial, vague descriptions, missing records, suspicious silences. But the pattern matches what we've seen elsewhere in Europe. When succession was everything, fragile heirs were erased with a speed and efficiency rivaling any battlefield manoeuvre. You drift into St. James's Palace, its walls echoing with centuries of laughter, mourning and intrigue. Here, too, the rumour mill churned. A servant whispers to a page whispers to a lady-in-waiting. By evening, the story has spread across London taverns, embroidered with new details. The prince smiles too much, one says. The princess has the face of an angel but the mind of a child, says another. Each phrase could mean many things, but the undertone is always the same. The air is fragile and the crown is at risk. Your third joke comes with a smirk. Imagine a London gossip scribbling in his diary. The king's heir is too weak to sit a horse. Perhaps he should ride a sheep instead. The humour is cruel, but in rumour mills, cruelty often masqueraded as entertainment. The truth, however, is that behind those jokes and pamphlets were real families grappling with grief and secrecy. Queens who held their children tightly, kings who paced their chambers in frustration, nurses who sang lullabies to infants destined never to rule. Their stories are obscured by the rumour mill, but the echoes remain, shaping the way dynasties rose and fell. As you step out of this English corridor, the air tastes of soot and rain. The whispers fade, replaced by the steady toll of church bells from Westminster. England's veiled rumour mill may never yield all its secrets, but the pattern is unmistakable. Fragile heirs erased, whispered about, and transformed into weapons of politics. The nursery here was not just a private chamber, but a battlefield of rumour, where crowns could be lost before a child ever learned to walk. The corridor curves once more, carrying you back toward the Iberian Peninsula, where the air feels heavy with incense and orange blossoms, where marble floors stay cool even in summer, and where dynasties still shiver at the memory of fragile heirs. You're stepping now into the chambers of an infanta, a Spanish princess, whose life, though wrapped in silk and splendour, carried sorrow carved deep by her own body's frailty. In her, the pattern of the curse reveals itself not only in whispered cradles, but in a grown woman whose every gesture betrayed both majesty and fragility. Spain, by the 17th century, had grown weary with its own grandeur. The riches of the New World flowed into Madrid, but debts, wars, and dynastic decline weighed heavily. The Habsburgs clung stubbornly to their legacy, but generation after generation their bloodline faltered. You recall Charles II, the bewitched king, but his story is only one side of the coin. Tonight you lean closer to the tale of the Infanta, the royal daughter who lived long enough to sit in portraits, to be promised in marriage, to walk through palaces, and yet her life was marked by sorrow that stemmed not from politics alone, but from her body's delicate inheritance. A mainstream historical fact anchors this setting. Infanta Margarita Teresa of Spain, the young princess immortalised in Diego Velázquez's painting Las Meninas, was married off at 15 to her uncle, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. Her life was short. She died at just 21, after years of ill health and repeated miscarriages. While her specific condition is still debated, her fragile constitution reflects the broader dynastic collapse caused by inbreeding. Her sorrow became symbolic of a dynasty on the brink. But in the whispers around the court, there were other infantas, lesser known, whose fragility went beyond delicate health to what we now recognise as developmental differences. Some records describe princesses as angelic, or innocent of mind. Historians still argue whether these were euphemisms for intellectual disability, possibly Down syndrome. The words are vague, blurred by the etiquette of chroniclers who dared not speak plainly. Yet in the silences you hear the echo of truth. Royal daughters hidden behind veils, spared the throne but not the sorrow. Step into a chamber in the Alcazar of Madrid. The air smells of beeswax and lilies. The sound of fountains murmurs through open windows. A young infanta sits on a cushioned chair dressed in brocade heavy with pearls. Her hands rest stiffly on her lap, her gaze soft, her smile unguarded. Courtiers bow, but some avert their eyes. To describe her as blessed is safer than to admit her difference. She's painted perhaps by Velázquez himself, the brush smoothing away the traits the court would rather forget. Yet even in the softened lines the viewer can sense her innocence, her sorrow. A fringe tidbit emerges. In Spain, fragile royal daughters were often sent into convents, where their conditions could be cloaked in piety. Officially they were devoted to God. Unofficially, the convents became sanctuaries for children deemed unsuitable for dynastic marriage. Some convents in Madrid and Toledo housed entire wings of noblewomen who had been quietly withdrawn from court. Their names carried on, but their lives veiled in silence. Here's your first gentle joke to ease the heaviness. You can almost imagine a weary abbess sighing to her nuns. Another princess at the gate? At this rate, our convent will outshine the palace in pedigree, its gallows humour, but it captures the absurdity of dynasties hiding their fragility behind cloister walls. The infanta's sorrow was not only her own. Imagine her mother, the queen, pacing late at night, clutching rosary beads until her fingers cramped. Every royal child was both a blessing and a political necessity. To bear a daughter who could not be married into alliance, or worse, a daughter whose body was too frail for childbirth, was both a personal grief and a dynastic failure. And yet, mothers still loved, still held their children close, still sang lullabies even when courtiers whispered behind their backs. A quirky tidbit drifts in. Spanish nurses sometimes tucked tiny pouches of dried orange blossoms into infants' swaddling to calm their spirits. You picture an infanta rocking gently, her silk gown perfumed faintly with citrus, while her nurse whispered stories of saints. The gesture feels tender, but also futile. No flower could ward off the dynasty's hidden curse. You pass into another gallery where portraits line the walls. One infanta after another stares back, round cheeks, stiff gowns, solemn eyes. Were all of them healthy, or did painters disguise fragility with layers of varnish and idealised proportions? The longer you look, the more the sorrow seeps through the brushstrokes. These were not just portraits, they were propaganda, insisting on strength where little existed. Historians still argue about how many Spanish infantas were deliberately hidden from history. Records exist of daughters baptised and then never mentioned again, their lives ending in silence or cloister. The ambiguity is maddening, and yet it tells you enough. The silence itself is evidence of sorrow. Your second joke comes now, whispered as if by a sarcastic courtier. The princess smiles so sweetly she must be a saint. Pity saints don't produce heirs. The humour is cruel, but you sense how gossip weaponised fragility, turning children into political liabilities. The Alcazar's chapel glows with candlelight. Here, fragile infantas were baptised, confirmed, buried. The cycle of sacrament framed their short lives. You can almost hear the echo of Gregorian chant, low and mournful, as the court prayed for strength it knew would not come. One more quirky detail before the night deepens. In Spanish superstition, a child who could not thrive was sometimes called mal de ojo, victim of the evil eye. Amulets of coral and jet were pinned to their gowns to ward off curses. Picture a princess draped in pearls, rubies and coral charms, her body a walking contradiction of wealth and fear. Your third joke surfaces gently to keep you awake. Imagine a jester bowing before the king and whispering, "Your Majesty, perhaps we should crown the coral charm itself." It seems to do more for the dynasty than your heir's risky humour, but Jester survived by balancing truth and folly. The sorrow of the Spanish Infanta was not hers alone, but the dynasty's. Her frailty, her hidden life, her early death, all became part of a larger pattern of decline. Spain's grandeur, its armadas and cathedrals, was built on the backs of fragile heirs who could not carry it. As you leave the Alcazar behind, you glance once more at the painted faces of infantas in their stiff gowns. Their sorrow lingers in the silence of the gallery, in the brushstrokes that conceal more than they reveal. And you, night owl, step away with the knowledge that behind every jewel-encrusted crown was a fragile child, a sorrow carefully veiled in silk. The corridor bends toward the Atlantic now, the air warmer, tinged with salt and the faint sweetness of figs. You're in Portugal, the western edge of Europe, where whitewashed palaces gaze out over the sea and dynasties dreamed of empire across the oceans. Yet even here, in the land of navigators and explorers, the greatest uncertainty was not on the waves, but in the cradle. A cradle where silence hung heavier than lullabies, where the survival of the crown itself trembled at the weakness of a single child. This is Portugal's story, a cradle of silence, a dynasty undone not only by storms at sea, but by frailty within its own walls. You glide across the cool marble of the Ribeira Palace in Lisbon, the seat of power for centuries. Sunlight filters through tall windows, scattering across gilded furniture, but the warmth cannot soften the unease in the nursery. Courtiers stand at a distance, whispering. The queen rocks an infant gently, her face pale with worry. For in this kingdom, as in so many others, an heir was more than a child. It was the future of the nation. And when the heir faltered, the silence was deafening. A mainstream historical fact grounds this tale. The Avis dynasty in Portugal ended in crisis after King Sebastian I, the young and fragile monarch, died childless in 1578 at the disastrous Battle of Alcaia Quibia. Sebastian's frailty was remarked upon even in his youth. He was described as shy, delicate, overly pious. Though not diagnosed in modern terms, some accounts suggest developmental delays or possible disabilities that shaped his sheltered, almost otherworldly demeanour. His inability to produce an heir threw Portugal into turmoil, leading to the Iberian Union under Spanish control. The silence of one cradle, in other words, changed the fate of an entire kingdom. You lean closer into the nursery chambers, where tapestries depict caravels sailing toward Africa and Brazil. The irony bites. You realise Portugal conquered half the world, but could not conquer the fragility of its own bloodline. Imagine the Queen's prayers echoing through cloisters, desperate for a son to thrive. Imagine the midwives sprinkling holy water more than once, as though extra blessings might anchor the infant in life. And yet, again and again, silence followed. A fringe tidbit drifts your way. In some Portuguese royal records, infants are described not by name but by euphemisms like angel in heaven or little saint. These phrases often masked disabilities or early deaths. It was a way to acknowledge the child without confronting the reality of fragility. You can almost see the scribes pausing over their quills, hesitant to write plainly, settling instead for veiled language that carried both love and denial. You move further into the era of the Braganza dynasty, where Jerome V and his descendants ruled with Baroque splendour. The Braganzas produced many children, but not all thrived. Historians still argue whether certain princes recorded as infirm showed traits of Down syndrome or other conditions. One prince in the 18th century was described as simple and sweet, beloved of his nurses but unfit for governance. The ambiguity remains, but the pattern is familiar. A cradle silenced, an heir erased, succession thrown into uncertainty. Here comes your first gentle joke of the section. Imagine a Portuguese courtier sighing over wine. We've mapped the stars for navigation, but can we chart a course for stronger heirs? Apparently not. You chuckle softly, knowing humour was as much a survival strategy as prayer. Step with me into Mafra Palace, the colossal convent palace built by Jerome V. Its endless corridors echo with the shuffle of monks, the tolling of bells. Somewhere within, a fragile child was tucked away, their existence cloaked by the solemnity of the church. Convents and monasteries again became havens for children whose conditions the dynasty dared not display. Officially, they were devoted to God. Unofficially, they were exiled into silence. A quirky tidbit makes you pause. In Portuguese folk belief, Tying a red ribbon to a baby's wrist was thought to ward off the evil eye. Imagine a royal infant swaddled in embroidered silk, with a humble ribbon tied tight around one tiny wrist. The clash of superstition and splendour sums up the contradiction of the dynasty. Gold from Brazil, spices from India, and yet the survival of the throne trusted to a strip of thread. Historians still argue whether Sebastian's frailty was exaggerated by later chroniclers who sought to explain away his military disaster. Was he truly delicate? Or was his legend reshaped into that of a weakling to justify political upheaval? The debate continues, but the effect is the same. One fragile heir, one cradle of silence, and Portugal's independence slipped into Spanish hands for 60 years. Your second joke slips in like sea foam at the shore. Imagine Lisbon's council scribbling contingency plans. Plan A, the king marries and produces heirs. Plan B, wait for a miracle. Plan C, annexation by Spain. Not the most inspiring list of options, and yet it proved prophetic. You wander now through the ruins of the Ribera Palace, destroyed in the 1755 earthquake. Amid the rubble, you picture the countless cradles that once stood here, rocked by nurses and blessed by priests, their occupants erased by silence. The quake swallowed marble and gold, but the silence had already swallowed heirs long before. One more quirky tidbit before you leave. In Portugal, fragile children were sometimes believed to be saudade encarnada, the living embodiment of longing or sorrow. The phrase reveals something profound. Disability was wrapped not just in stigma, but in poetry, an attempt to soften what could not be accepted. Imagine a princess described as saudade itself, her life a living metaphor for the melancholy soul of Portugal. Your third joke comes in softly, like a lullaby turned sardonic. Picture a Portuguese poet scribbling, "Our heirs are so fragile they belong more to heaven than to Lisbon. Perhaps the angels will make better monarchs." You smile wryly, knowing humour often concealed despair. As you step away from Portugal's cradle of silence, the sea wind brushes your face, carrying the scent of salt and roses. Behind you, the palaces shimmer faintly in memory, their nurseries filled with both love and erasure. Ahead lies another corridor, another dynasty, but the pattern remains. Crowns undone not by swords or storms, but by the soft silence of fragile cradles. The air stiffens, sharp as the click of boots on cobblestones. You have crossed into Prussia now, where the walls are stripped of Baroque flourishes and dressed instead in austere order. The ceilings are lower, the light harsher, and the corridors echo with the rhythm of discipline. Here, soldiers drilled in squares until their feet bled. Kings counted buttons on uniforms, and dynasties prized toughness above all else. And yet, for all the emphasis on strength, the royal nurseries of Prussia bore their own fragility. Heirs who could not live up to the martial standards, children hushed away when their bodies or minds did not fit the mould. This is where Prussian discipline met its undoing. You tread across black and white tiled floors, your bare feet absorbing the chill. The air smells faintly of iron, leather, and the smoke of tobacco pipes. Portraits of stern-faced Hohenzollerns glare from the walls, their eyes as sharp as bayonets. These kings were obsessed with military order, but you can already sense how brittle the image was, how easily undone by the frailty of a child in the cradle. A mainstream historical fact anchors you here. Frederick William I, the so-called soldier king, demanded that his court be run like a barracks. He built one of the most formidable armies in Europe, but his own children suffered under his rigidity. His son, Frederick the Great, was mocked in youth for being delicate, artistic, and unsuited for military life. Though Frederick did not have Down syndrome, his struggles highlight a deeper truth. Prussia tolerated no fragility, and any child born with true developmental differences would have been concealed with ruthless efficiency. You enter a nursery within the Berlin city palace. The room is stark compared to Versailles or Vienna. Plain wooden cradles, little ornamentation beyond Lutheran crosses on the walls. Imagine a child here, soft-featured, slower to speak or walk, in a dynasty obsessed with drilling, marching, and exactitude. Nurses whisper, "The prince is gentle," but in Prussian code, gentle was no compliment. It meant unfit, unsoldierly, a disappointment. The crown could not rest on such shoulders. A fringe tidbit floats into the silence. Some Prussian records from the 17th century describe infants as own craft, without strength. In dynastic registers, those words are almost always followed by silence, the child's name disappearing after baptism. Historians still argue whether these omissions masked cases of Down syndrome or other conditions, but the language is suspicious in its vagueness. The Prussian obsession with discipline left a little room for nuance. Weakness was erased, not explained. And here comes your first gentle joke. You can almost hear Frederick William I muttering, "The boy can't march in step." Then he's not a boy at all. The harsh humour of a man who measured worth in goose steps and musket drills. Imagine how quickly he would have hidden an heir who could not hold a sword. The corridors grow narrower, lined with tall windows that let in cold, grey light. Outside you see parade grounds stretching into the distance, soldiers drilling like clockwork. Inside, though, the hush of the nursery undermines all that precision. One fragile child, one cradle of difference, could undo years of discipline. A quirky tidbit drifts in. In some parts of Prussia, midwives practiced a ritual of plunging newborns into cold water to harden them. Imagine a royal infant, delicate and soft, thrust into icy basins in a desperate attempt to banish fragility. Perhaps it toughened some, but for those born with differences, no amount of cold water could erase their condition. The ritual only deepened the sorrow. Historians still argue whether Prussia's rigid culture created even harsher concealments than elsewhere in Europe. In Spain or France, fragile heirs were cloaked in mysticism, described as angelic. In Prussia, there was no poetry, only a mission. If the heir could not march, he vanished from record. A silence as sharp as a sabre's edge. Your second joke slips in like the clink of a beer stein. Imagine the drill sergeants rewriting their manuals. Step 1, line up. Step 2, march. Step 3, if you cannot march, disappear. Efficiency, Prussian style. Step deeper into the Berlin Palace Chapel. The air is cold, the stone echoing with Lutheran hymns. Here lie small coffins, their names carved simply, no elaborate epitaphs. The Prussian style of mourning was stripped, severe, almost militaristic. Grief was acknowledged, but not lingered upon. Yet you can sense the sorrow beneath. For all their harshness, parents still wept, still prayed, still rocked fragile children in their arms before silence claimed them. A quirky tidbit softens the mood. In Prussian folk tradition, it was said that children born with unusual gentleness carried Himmelsruhe, the peace of heaven. In villages, such children were sometimes cherished as closer to angels. Imagine the dissonance of this belief colliding with the royal obsession for discipline. A peasant family might cradle such a child with tenderness, while a royal family rushed them into obscurity. Your third joke rises like smoke from a chimney. Picture a Prussian bureaucrat drafting a report. On the state of the Crown Prince, he neither marches nor shouts. Recommend immediate exile to the nursery. You can almost hear the dry sarcasm in the ink. The truth beneath the humour is stark. Prussia's might was built on the image of perfection, soldiers aligned like chess pieces, kings cast in iron. But one fragile heir threatened to expose the illusion, and so the dynasty relied on silence, burying not just children but entire possibilities, replacing frailty with military spectacle. As you step out into the palace courtyard, snowflakes begin to fall, muffling the sound of boots on stone. The soldiers march on, muskets gleaming, flags snapping in the wind. But you know the truth now. All that order, all that discipline, was undone in the hush of nurseries where fragile heirs were erased. The corridor stretches ahead again, drawing you away from Prussia's stern walls. Behind you, the sound of drums fades, leaving only the memory of a cradle, empty, silent, and unwritten. The corridor bends south, and suddenly the air warms with the scent of lemon trees, incense, and the faint sweetness of olive oil lamps. Marble glows under your feet, and the walls bloom with frescoes of saints and mythic heroes. You're in Italy now, land of Renaissance brilliance, of ducal courts and papal intrigues, where beauty was prized above all else. But even in these gilded palaces, amid Raphael's brushstrokes and Michelangelo's chisel, fragile heirs lay cradled in silence. Tonight you're here to peer into the chambers of Italian courts, where one fragile jewel after another was hidden behind painted screens. The Medici in Florence, the Este in Ferrara, the Gonzaga in Mantua, the Sforza in Milan, the Farnese in Parma. The names themselves glitter. Yet their nurseries tell a quieter story. Infants born with bodies that faltered, princes and princesses who did not grow into the roles prepared for them. Italy's courts perfected pageantry, but they also perfected concealment. A mainstream historical fact roots you here. Cosimo I de' Medici, Duke of Florence, fathered numerous children, including sons and daughters destined for alliances across Europe. But chroniclers note that not all his offspring thrived. Several died in infancy, and one daughter, Maria, was described vaguely as innocent of understanding. Historians still argue whether that phrase meant intellectual disability, possibly Down syndrome, or whether it was a pious euphemism. The ambiguity fits the pattern you've seen before. Dynasties unwilling to admit what they could not control. Step into a Florentine nursery. The walls are painted with cherubs, their faces soft and round, their eyes lifted toward heaven. The cradle in the corner is carved from walnut, draped in embroidered linens, but the infant inside seems too quiet, too gentle. Nurses exchange glances. A courtier notes in his diary, "She smiles always, though she does not speak." The entry ends there, silence swallowing the rest. A fringe tidbit shimmers into your ear. In 16th century Italy, fragile children of noble birth were sometimes presented publicly in religious processions as symbols of innocence. Rather than admitting disability, families framed them as living saints, pure souls untouched by worldly corruption. Imagine a young princess carried through the streets, her soft features kissed by sunlight, while crowds whispered about miracles rather than frailty. It was a strategy both compassionate and calculating. You move into Mantua, where the Gonzaga family ruled. The palaces here are painted with mythological scenes, Zeus hurling thunderbolts, Hercules strangling serpents, and yet, tucked away behind these walls, records mention Gonzaga infants of tender frame, who never reached adulthood. One was noted as lacking vigour in speech. Was this Down syndrome, or another condition? Historians still argue, but the silence is telling. Your first gentle joke slips in now. You can almost hear a Renaissance courtier sigh. We hired Michelangelo to sculpt David, but even he cannot chisel strength into our heirs. The irony bites, a reminder that art could glorify, but it could not alter the truth of a fragile child. The Este of Ferrara too whispered their sorrows. Chroniclers noted one Este princess as angelic of face but simple of mind. That phrase alone could mean many things, but when combined with her retreat into a convent at a young age, the suggestion is clear. Her fragility was cloaked in piety, her crown replaced with a veil. In Italy, the convent was the most common fate for royal daughters who did not fit dynastic needs. A quirky tidbit sweetens the air. Italian nurses often placed protective amulets of coral around infants' necks to ward off illness. Coral was believed to hold the sea's vitality. Picture a jewel-adorned princess, her gown heavy with pearls and coral charms, her family hoping that red stone might banish weakness. Jewellery here was not just decoration, it was a shield against fate. The Medici, of course, were masters of image. Portraits of their children were commissioned almost obsessively, and yet some of those paintings are suspiciously idealised. One boy painted with unusually round features later disappears from records altogether. The portrait survives, the child does not. Was he hidden? Was he erased? The canvas holds more questions than answers. Historians still argue whether the Italian courts, with their obsession for beauty and perfection, were even harsher than others in their concealment. Spain cloaked fragility in mysticism, Austria in silence, England in rumour. But Italy, where every face was painted and every gesture sculpted, had the most to lose. To admit imperfection was to undermine the entire Renaissance ideal of harmony. And so, fragile children became jewels of innocence, locked away in caskets of silence. Your second joke softens the weight. Imagine a Florentine banker muttering, "We can calculate interest rates to the last coin, but we cannot calculate how many heirs survive past infancy. God must be the worst accountant of all." You laugh gently, sensing how sarcasm coexisted with sorrow. Step now into Parma, where the Farnese dynasty glittered briefly. One Farnese child was described in records as gentle of heart, not suited for worldly affairs. The words echo like a sigh. He never ruled. He lived and died in seclusion. His siblings carried on alliances, but his name faded, as if carved in water. A quirky tidbit floats to you from Naples. Their fragile heirs were sometimes said to be kissed by the moon. The phrase sounds lovely, but beneath its poetry lies the same unease, the recognition that a child's differences needed myth to soften them. Imagine a Neapolitan princess gazing out at the full moon, courtiers whispering she was touched by its light, even as her future was quietly erased. Your third joke flickers like candlelight. Picture an Italian jester bowing to his duke and quipping, "Your grace, your son may not conquer lands, but he has conquered smiles." Half the court laughs at him, the other half laughs with him. Risky humour, but jesters survived by daring where others feared. The deeper truth, though, is that Italy's fragile jewels left their mark on dynastic fate. Marriages failed when daughters were unfit for alliances. Succession weakened when sons were cloistered instead of crowned. Even in the heart of the Renaissance, where genius flourished, the same fragile pattern unfolded. Cradles rocked in silence, portraits painted into lies, convent veils hiding dynastic failures. You leave the Italian court with frescoes still glowing in your vision, saints and gods peering down as if judging. Behind you, the fragile jewels of Italy linger. Princesses called saints, princes erased, crowns slipped quietly into silence. Ahead, the corridor darkens again, drawing you north toward another dynasty's sorrow. The corridor curls back upon itself, and you find your feet returning to Spain, not to the candlelit whispers of earlier halls, but to a heavier, almost suffocating atmosphere. The air here is thick with incense and dust, with the weight of centuries pressing down upon marble floors and gilded ceilings. You have entered the late Habsburg court again, where the dynasty's obsession with purity had already collapsed under its own gravity, and yet the curse seemed determined to replay itself like a refrain no one could silence. This is the Habsburg curse renewed, a tale not just of fragile cradles, but of repetition, as though destiny itself were mocking a family that refused to learn. You move across the checkerboard tiles of Madrid's palaces, the walls lined with crucifixes and portraits, the ceilings painted with angels whose wings seem too heavy to lift. The hush here is more ominous than anywhere you've been. It's as if everyone knows the dynasty is running out of heirs, but no one dares say it aloud. In this hush lies the story of the children who carried the last flickering hopes of the Spanish Habsburgs, and whose bodies, once again, betrayed them. A mainstream historical fact anchors the scene. By the 17th century, the Habsburg dynasty of Spain was nearing extinction. The repeated intermarriages had left the bloodline riddled with genetic weakness. The infamous Habsburg jaw was only the outward symbol. Behind it lay infertility, miscarriages, stillbirths, and fragile heirs. Charles II, whom you've already glimpsed, was the final product of this inbreeding, a king so delicate that Spain's empire collapsed under his reign. Yet even before Charles, and even within his own generation, other children displayed the same curse. Imagine entering a nursery in the Alcazar. The cradles are draped in crimson velvet, embroidered with golden thread, but inside one lies an infant whose face is gentle, whose limbs are soft, whose cries are weaker than expected. Nurses rock the child in silence. Courtiers exchange glances. The word is never spoken. No one dares say deformed or infirm, but everyone feels the weight. The dynasty is slipping, one fragile body at a time. A fringe tidbit emerges. Some Spanish chroniclers of the late 17th century recorded the births of royal infants only in baptismal registers, not in court chronicles. These children were often described as pure souls returned to heaven, a phrase that hid not just early death but possible disabilities. It was easier to sanctify them as angels than to acknowledge that their fragility was the dynasty's undoing. Your first gentle joke drifts in like candle smoke. You can almost imagine a weary courtier muttering, "The angels are running a nursery larger than ours. They seem to claim every child we send." The humour is grim, but it captures the sense of helpless repetition. Charles II himself embodied the renewal of the curse. His body was frail, his intellect limited, his ability to govern almost non-existent. But what haunts you tonight are the whispers of his siblings and cousins, children less documented yet equally fragile. One sister was described as sweet of disposition but slow of wit. Another cousin, promised in marriage to strengthen alliances, was quietly withdrawn when her health declined. Historians still argue whether these hints indicate Down syndrome or other conditions, but the pattern of silence is too familiar to ignore. You drift now into a chapel within the palace. The air is thick with the smell of incense, the flicker of hundreds of candles reflecting on guilt. Here, fragile children were baptized, buried and mourned all within the same space. Priests chanted Latin prayers, invoking God's will, but behind their solemnity lay the dynasty's desperation. Every time a coffin the size of a cradle was carried in, another thread of the Habsburg tapestry unravelled. A quirky tidbit surfaces. In 17th century Spain, it was believed that holy relics could strengthen infants. Charles II's nurses reportedly brought him relics to sleep beside, including pieces of saintly bones wrapped in silk. Imagine the absurdity. An infant prince sleeping with fragments of skeletons, as if holiness could fix genetics. You can almost smell the musty fabric, the weight of superstition pressing into the cradle. Your second joke slips into the gloom. Picture a nurse whispering, "If relics don't work, perhaps we should just wrap him in the entire cathedral." Desperation makes jesters of everyone. You walk through another gallery, portraits looming on every wall. Here you see faces with the unmistakable Habsburg chin jutting proudly, or grotesquely forward. Yet in some portraits, the eyes appear softer, the gaze unfocused, the mouth slightly slack. Were these artistic accidents, or subtle truths left in the brushstrokes despite orders to idealize? You lean closer, and the sorrow seeps through the oil. Even art could not fully conceal the curse. Historians still argue whether Charles II's condition was unique, or simply the visible extreme of a dynasty already collapsing. Some suggest his entire family line bore hidden cases of disability, veiled behind convent walls and ambiguous language. Others argue that his problems were purely inbreeding compounded, not specifically Down syndrome. The debate swirls endlessly, like incense in the chapel. What remains undeniable is that fragile heirs defined the dynasty's decline. You imagine the council chambers of Madrid, filled with stiff-backed nobles debating succession. Papers are spread across the table, maps unfurled, treaties drafted. Yet all of it depends on one child who cannot walk without aid, who cannot produce heirs, who cannot govern. You almost laugh at the absurdity. Empires collapsing not from cannons but from chromosomes. Your third joke drifts out, weary but sharp. Picture the council secretary scribbling, "Plan for empire, hope the king survives. Plan for succession, hope harder." A dynasty reduced to prayers and paperwork. The renewal of the curse was not just biological but symbolic. The Spanish people themselves began to see their monarchy as bewitched, cursed, unfit. Pamphlets mocked Charles II as the bewitched king, attributing his weakness to sorcery rather than inbreeding. It was easier to blame witches than to face the truth. Even today, legends swirl of spells cast upon his cradle, of hexes lingering in the palace halls. You feel the chill of those stories, the way superstition wrapped fragility and myth. Step into the gardens now, where fountains murmur and orange trees bloom. You can almost see a fragile infanta tottering on the gravel path, her nurse guiding her steps, courtiers watching with forced smiles. Every stumble whispered disaster, every delayed word suggested doom. These gardens, designed for harmony, only heightened the dissonance between image and reality. Another fringe tidbit wafts in. Some Spanish physicians of the period prescribed powdered emerald mixed with wine for fragile children, believing the gemstone's strength would pass into the body. Imagine tiny lips stained green, courtiers insisting the child looked healthier afterward. It was placebo dressed in emerald dust. As the sun sets in your vision, you look back at the palace, the towers and spires glowing red in twilight. The curse feels heavier here than anywhere else, as if the stones themselves carry sorrow. Spain's mightiest dynasty, once rulers of half the globe, undone by fragile heirs repeating the same story again and again. The Habsburg curse renewed itself, not because of one child, but because the dynasty refused to change course. Marriages tightened the noose, secrecy deepened the silence, and every cradle rocked with more than an infant. It rocked with the weight of empire. And so, night owl, you step away from Madrid once more. The bells of the cathedral toll behind you, slow and mournful. The curse lingers in your ears, a whisper of fragility, a reminder that empires fall not only from battles lost, but from cradles silenced. The corridor stretches northward now, and the air grows sharper, brisk with the smell of pine, sea spray, and wood smoke. Tapestries fade into simpler weaves of wool, and gilded ceilings give way to carved timbers blackened by firelight. You've arrived in Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, lands of sagas and frost, where kings once wore crowns of iron and carved their histories into stone. Here, dynasties endured long winters and short summers, but even the hardest warrior kings were not spared from fragile airs. In these northern thrones, silence covered the cradles, just as snow covers the ground. The heirs who could not rule were tucked away in convents, country estates, or simply omitted from chronicles. Their absence became part of the saga, a quiet erasure in kingdoms that valued strength. You tread across wooden planks that creak beneath your weight, the scent of tar and whale oil hanging in the air. Courtiers in fur-lined cloaks pass through dim corridors, their whispers softer than in Spain or France, but just as deadly. A prince who did not thrive, a princess who lagged in speech. These were matters not of scandal, but of survival. In small kingdoms with fragile successions, one delicate heir could unmake alliances as swiftly as a lost battle. A mainstream historical fact anchors you. King Christian II of Denmark, 1481 to 1559, remembered for his brutality, fathered children whose fates were not all recorded with clarity. Several died young, and whispers clung to the silence around them. Later, Christian VII of Denmark, 18th century, became infamous for his mental instability. Though not linked to Down syndrome, his reign reveals how fragile heirs could destabilize entire realms. His condition allowed his physician, Struensee, to seize power, plunging Denmark into chaos. The precedent was clear. A fragile ruler meant open season for political manipulation. But what of those children never crowned, never even acknowledged? Here, your imagination steps carefully into a nursery in Stockholm's Trikrona castle before it burned. The firelight glows on painted icons of saints, and on wooden cradles carved with runic patterns. Inside one, a soft-faced infant lies quiet, round-eyed, slow to respond to the nurse's touch. A servant whispers, "The child is like a flower, too delicate for winter." The words are tender, but behind them lies fear. The court cannot parade such fragility before rival kingdoms. The cradle becomes a secret. A fringed tidbit drifts in like drifting snow. In Sweden, records from the Vasa dynasty note a princess described as mild of spirit, more suited to heaven than earth. The phrasing echoes across Europe, but in the sparse northern style it is almost brutal. Historians still argue whether this phrase signified developmental disability, Down syndrome among them, or whether it was simply shorthand for frailty. The silence in the record leaves only shadows. Your first joke crackles like a fire log. Imagine a Swedish courtier muttering over mulled wine. The boy can't wield an axe, then perhaps he'll serve as a doorstop instead. The humour is cruel, but in a kingdom where warrior strength defined legitimacy, sarcasm became a shield against dread. Move with me into Denmark's Rosenborg Castle, where the halls smell of beeswax and salt air. The portraits here are stiff, northern, less flattering than Italian canvases, yet even in these earnest depictions you notice the same pattern. Children painted into existence who vanish from record soon after. Were they taken by disease, or were they tucked away, their differences unspoken? The vagueness is its own confession. A quirky tidbit lightens the weight. Scandinavian midwives sometimes placed iron keys beneath infants' pillows to ward off trolls and changelings. Picture a royal nursery where silver rattles gleam beside a plain iron key, as if the future of the dynasty could be secured by keeping away fairies. You almost laugh, though the desperation behind the ritual is obvious. Historians still argue whether Scandinavia's smaller monarchies faced harsher consequences from fragile heirs than larger empires did. Spain and France could fall back on sprawling dynastic networks. Denmark or Sweden had fewer options. One weak heir could tilt the balance of succession into civil war, and so concealment became even more urgent. A child described as angelic might never appear in public again, their name reduced to a footnote in baptismal records. Your second joke echoes across the wooden beams. Imagine the Council of Stockholm sighing, "We've built ships to cross the Baltic, but we can't build heirs to cross the nursery." The irony bites through the chill. Step into Norway now, where medieval kings once ruled from stone halls by fjords. Chronicles there are sparse, but sagas mention princes who died mysteriously young, daughters cloistered before marriage age. The sagas, with their love of heroic exaggeration, rarely admitted frailty, but silence between the lines suggests what could not be said. Perhaps one of those unnamed children smiled too gently, walked too late, or spoke too little, and so was wrapped in the cloak of ill fortune. Another quirky tidbit drifts like mist from a fjord. In rural folklore, children born with unusual features were sometimes called huldrebarn, hidden children linked to the spirits of the forest. Imagine how that belief trickled into royal nurseries, where fragile infants might be described as touched by the hidden folk. A poetic veil, but still a veil. You pass into a Lutheran chapel, sparse and cold, its candles flickering faintly. Here lie nameless graves, small stones etched only with crosses. In these graves, perhaps, rest the hidden heirs of northern thrones, children silenced by both death and secrecy. The hymn that rises in your imagination is mournful, its cadence long, its notes fading into the cold air like breath on frost. Your third joke comes softly to warm the edges. Picture a Danish jester bowing before his king and saying, "Your Majesty, if heirs fail again, perhaps crown a codfish." At least it breeds reliably risky humour, but jesters lived on the edge of danger. The deeper truth lingers. In Scandinavia, as in the rest of Europe, fragile heirs shaped dynastic fate, not through their actions, but through their absences. Wars were fought, alliances broken, crowns exchanged hands, all because of cradles that fell silent, heirs hidden, fragility veiled. The North may have cloaked its secrets in snow and sagas, but the pattern is clear. As you step out of these northern halls, the air sharpens against your cheeks. You hear gulls crying over harbours, smell tar from ships, feel pine smoke clinging to your hair. Behind you the hidden heirs remain, fragile jewels tucked into convents, erased from sagas, their sorrow frozen into silence. Ahead, another corridor awaits, one that leads not into secrecy but into revolution. The corridor bends once more, and suddenly the air is thick with gunpowder smoke, candle grease, and the faint tang of fear. You have stepped into France again, but this time not into Versailles' glittering halls. No, this is Paris in upheaval, where drums beat in the streets, pamphlets flutter like dead leaves, and the monarchy itself trembles under the cry of revolution. Yet even in this storm, there is a child in the shadows, a boy whose fragility became both weapon and myth. Tonight, you lean close to the story of Louis XVII, the forgotten child of the French Revolution. Picture the scene, July heat pressing against stone walls, the air buzzing with shouts from the streets. Inside the Tuileries Palace, Marie Antoinette cradles her son Louis Charles, the second Dauphin, the boy who would become Louis XVII in name if never in rule. His brother Louis Joseph had already died at age 7 after years of illness, described as fragile and sickly from birth. Now all hope rests on this younger son. But the revolution does not pause for nursery prayers. A mainstream historical fact sets your footing. Louis Charles was only 8 when his father, Louis XVI, was executed. He was imprisoned in the Temple Tower, separated from his family, neglected and abused. He died at just 10 years old in 1795, his small body consumed by tuberculosis, or so the official record says. But surrounding his short life are rumours, speculations and accusations that he was developmentally delayed, that he had Down syndrome, or that his condition was exaggerated by revolutionaries eager to tarnish the monarchy. Historians still argue fiercely. Step into the dank stone cell where the boy was kept. The air is damp, thick with mildew, the only light seeping through narrow slits. You see him hunched in a corner, his once gilded clothes replaced by rags. His round face, wide eyes and sluggish movements became fodder for gossip. Guards muttered that he was simple, angelic, weak. Pamphlets spread stories that the last Bourbon heir was unfit for the throne, not just politically, but physically. Whether true or propaganda, the damage was done. A fringe tidbit surfaces. Some revolutionaries claimed the boy could barely speak, describing him as a little lamb. They painted his frailty as evidence of Bourbon decadence, using his body as proof that the monarchy was cursed. Others, more sympathetic, insisted his silence came not from disability but from trauma and abuse. The truth is lost in the murk of politics. Here's your first gentle joke in the gloom. Imagine a revolutionary pamphleteer scribbling furiously, "The Dauphin cannot rule. He can barely count his bread rations." It's dark humour, yes, but pamphlets of the era thrived on cruel exaggeration. You step back into memory, into Versailles before the fall. Louis Charles, still a small boy, runs through gilded corridors, his laughter echoing. Servants whisper that he is slower than his peers, but the Queen insists he is perfect. Marie Antoinette calls him her chou d'amour, her cabbage of love. You can almost see her fingers smoothing his curls, her lips brushing his forehead. For a moment the revolution fades, and all you see is a mother loving her child. But the shadow returns quickly. Fragility, whether real or imagined, became a weapon that even maternal love could not shield. A quirky tidbit drifts in. In revolutionary France, some believed fragile children were proof of aristocratic corruption, that generations of luxury and incest had weakened the royal line. Imagine that theory shouted from taverns, wine sloshing from mugs as men jeered, "Their kings can't even breed strong sons." The cruel humour of revolution, sharper than any guillotine blade. Historians still argue whether Louis XVII truly had Down syndrome, or whether his perceived differences came from malnutrition, imprisonment, and trauma. Some accounts describe him as lively before captivity, others as unusually passive even in childhood. His corpse, when autopsied, showed signs of tuberculosis but no clear evidence of chromosomal difference. And yet the myth persists, because myths often matter more than facts. Your second joke cuts through the chill. Imagine a Jacobin sneering, "We have liberty, equality, fraternity, and apparently a Dauphin who naps through all three." The sarcasm stings, but it echoes the way rumour turned a child's fragility into comedy for the mob. Step now into the temple prison chapel, where priests whispered prayers for the boy. His small frame bowed beneath candlelight, his lips moved faintly, perhaps not in understanding, but in rote. Here, his sorrow was sanctified, even as politics consumed him. He became a symbol not of monarchy's strength, but of its weakness, a fragile jewel rattling in the revolution's storm. Another fringe tidbit glimmers. Some royalists insisted Louis XVII did not die in prison at all. They claimed the sickly boy's body belonged to another child, swapped to hide the real Dauphin's escape. In these rumours, the real Louis lived on, hidden in convents or smuggled abroad. The irony, of course, is that even in myth he was fragile, a shadow heir, never crowned, forever trapped between rumour and sorrow. A quirky folk belief winds in. In Paris, fragile children were sometimes called enfants de la lune, children of the moon. Poets saw them as dreamers, otherworldly. Imagine revolutionaries mocking the Dauphin as a moonchild, too lost in innocence to rule. Again, fragility became metaphor, weaponized and twisted. Your third joke arrives with weary irony. Picture a revolutionary guard muttering, "The boy eats little, speaks less, and does nothing." Truly he is already practicing to be king's sarcasm as survival, even in prisons. The deeper truth remains, Louis XVII was a child, fragile whether by nature or by circumstance, and he became a pawn in a larger game. His body, his supposed delays, his suffering, all were exploited to prove monarchy's failure. Whether he truly had Down syndrome or not, the perception of fragility helped topple a throne. You walk now through Parisian streets at dusk. The smell of bread and smoke lingers. The Seine glitters faintly in twilight. Behind you, the temple tower looms, its shadows long. Somewhere inside, a child once coughed, once cried, once fell silent. His name became legend, his body a rumour, his life a sorrow. The French Revolution devoured kings and queens, but it also devoured a fragile child. Louis XVII, the forgotten boy, remains a symbol of innocence lost, of fragility twisted into propaganda, of a cradle that never echoed with coronation bells. And you, night owl, carry his ghost with you as you step forward, deeper into the endless corridor of history. The corridor draws you into a new century now, where the air smells faintly of coal smoke, lavender water, and polished mahogany. You have entered the age of Queen Victoria, where portraits stiffened into photographs, where family values were staged as carefully as royal ceremonies, and where fragility was hidden not by cloisters or rumours, but by an iron curtain of propriety. The Victorians perfected the art of veiling sorrow, and nowhere was that more evident than in their royal nurseries. Step into Buckingham Palace during the 1840s. The carpets are thick, muffling footsteps. The walls are hung with paintings of wholesome family scenes, queens and princes smiling stiffly in carefully posed arrangements. Yet beyond those polished frames lies another reality. The British monarchy produced an abundance of children in this era. Victoria herself bore 9, but not all of them thrived as the portraits suggest. Some were frail, some quietly erased, some described in ways that today might hint at developmental differences. The Victorian veil ensured that weakness was hidden behind lace collars and polite phrases. A mainstream historical fact anchors you here. Queen Victoria's own extended family carried hereditary conditions. Haemophilia spread through her descendants, famously afflicting the Russian Tsarevich Alexei and several Spanish and German princes. But alongside this, letters and memoirs hint at children described as simple or gentle, words that may indicate cognitive disabilities. While no direct medical diagnoses exist, the silence in the record speaks volumes. In a century obsessed with progress and empire, a fragile heir was something to be concealed at all costs. Walk into a nursery in Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. The walls are bright with cheerful wallpaper, rocking horses stand ready, and dolls line the shelves. Yet in one corner, a nurse rocks a child whose development lags behind his siblings. He does not speak when expected. His smile lingers without context. His steps falter. The nurse hums a lullaby softly, aware that this child will never join the royal stage. The family photographs, when taken, may include him, but always placed carefully, framed to minimise notice. A fringe tidbit emerges. In Victorian aristocratic circles, fragile children were sometimes sent to country estates for their health, never to return to the public eye. Officially, they were away for fresh air and treatment. Unofficially, they were hidden. The monarchy was no exception. Historians still argue whether one of Queen Victoria's grandchildren, Prince John of the United Kingdom, son of George V and great-grandson of Victoria, represents the clearest case. Born decades later, in 1905, John had epilepsy and was described as not quite all there. Though his condition was likely not Down syndrome, he illustrates the royal pattern. Seclusion in a country house, rarely photographed, remembered as sweet but erased from politics. Back in Victoria's own day, the veil was linguistic as much as physical. Memoirs of courtiers occasionally mention royal children as delicate or special. The words sound affectionate, but they functioned as codes, cloaking fragility beneath euphemism. Your first gentle joke of the section flickers like gaslight. Imagine a Victorian governess writing in her diary. The young prince cannot recite his Latin, but at least he smiles handsomely for photographs. Perhaps that will be enough for Empire, a weary joke, but telling. The veil extended beyond Britain to her sprawling family tree. Victoria's descendants filled thrones across Europe, intermarrying with the Habsburgs, Romanovs and Bourbons. Fragile heirs in Spain, Russia and Germany were all, in part, her grandchildren or great-grandchildren, and yet their conditions were veiled with the same strategies: euphemisms, seclusion, and silence. In this way, the Victorian ethos of propriety became a dynastic tool, smothering inconvenient truths. A quirky tidbit floats in. Victorian nurseries often used elaborate soothing syrups containing opium to calm restless children. Imagine a fragile royal child, already weak, dosed with syrup to keep them quiet during official visits. The child drifts into drowsy silence, and the courtiers nod approvingly at how well-behaved he appears. It is chilling in retrospect, but at the time it fit neatly into the veil of appearances. Historians still argue whether the Victorians were uniquely harsh in their concealment, or simply more skilled at presenting an image. Earlier dynasties relied on silence or rumour. The Victorians had photography, newspapers, and empire propaganda to manage. Every portrait was curated, every public appearance staged. Fragile heirs, therefore, had to vanish even more completely to maintain the illusion of strength. Step into Windsor Castle's chapel, where stained glass glows crimson and gold. Here, family prayers were said for sick children, but public bulletins rarely mentioned them. Death announcements might use phrases like sudden illness or call to heaven early. The truth that some children had been frail from birth was tucked away under veils of Victorian propriety. Your second joke rustles like silk skirts. Imagine a palace clerk drafting the Gazette notice. Her Royal Highness's child has passed from sudden illness. He pauses, muttering, sudden. It's been years in the making. He sighs, dips his pen again and continues the fiction. Step further into the royal gardens where the children posed for photographs, their white dresses glowing in sunlight. You can almost see how photographers positioned them. Fragile children placed at the edges, or behind siblings, or absent entirely. The veil extended to glass plates and daguerreotypes, ensuring the Empire's image remained unshaken. A quirky folk belief lingers in the countryside. Some Victorians called fragile children cherubs, believing they were too angelic to live long. In royal circles, the same phrase appears in diaries and letters. Imagine a queen describing her daughter as a little cherub, her words both affectionate and coded, a way of signalling fragility without naming it. Your third joke arrives gently, tinged with melancholy. Imagine Prince Albert, Victoria's husband, tallying up the Empire's statistics with Germanic precision, railways, factories, exports, and then frowning. 9 children, and even the nursery has inefficiencies. We must industrialise better heirs. It's absurd, yet it fits the Victorian obsession with order. The veil, though, was not impenetrable. Fragments of truth slipped through letters, memoirs, and gossip. Courtiers admitted in private what public bulletins denied. Nurses carried memories of children who never appeared in portraits. And historians today, combing through archives, stumble across descriptions vague enough to raise suspicion. A child who smiled constantly. A prince of innocent heart but weak constitution. Each phrase hints at what the veil concealed. As the century rolled on, the veil extended even into the 20th. Prince John, though later than Victoria herself, stands as the emblem of the pattern. Royal fragility hidden from view, veiled in affectionate euphemism. When he died at age 13, his mother, Queen Mary, wrote simply, "He was a dear boy. Now he is at peace." No mention of the years of seclusion, the silence that defined his short life. The Victorian veil, even beyond Victoria's reign, remained intact. You leave Buckingham's halls now, the scent of lavender water lingering, the portraits staring with fixed smiles. The veil is still there in your mind, heavy lace obscuring truth. Behind it lie children remembered only as cherubs, or innocents, their fragility veiled for propriety's sake. And you, night owl, step forward, knowing that veils cannot last forever. The whispers always seep through. The corridor lengthens now, and the floor beneath you seems to shift. One moment it is marble from Madrid, the next oak from London, the next granite from Vienna. The air itself carries a medley of scents. Coal smoke, incense, orange blossoms and pine resin, as though every dynasty you have visited is merging into one final gallery. You're no longer in a single palace, but in a vast hallway lined with doors to every empire. And from behind each door come the same muffled sounds. A baby's cry, a nurse's lullaby, a courtier's whisper. Tonight you gather the threads together, listening to whispers across empires, where the fragile fates of heirs and hidden children shaped politics as profoundly as battles and treaties. You walk slowly now, your bare feet brushing stone and wood alike, and you realise that across Europe, despite cultural differences, the same strategies repeated themselves. Spain cloaked its fragile heirs in mysticism, Austria in silence, England in rumour, France in satire, Prussia in omission, Italy in saintly metaphors, Scandinavia in sagas, Portugal in saudade, and Britain in Victorian veils. Different words, different masks, but beneath them all lay the same truth. Down syndrome and other disabilities touched royal cradles just as they touch common ones. The difference was that when it happened in a palace, it threatened crowns, and so it was hidden, erased, or turned into myth. A mainstream historical fact broadens the stage. By the 19th century, nearly every European dynasty was interlinked. Queen Victoria's descendants sat on thrones from London to Berlin to St. Petersburg. The Habsburgs married into Bourbons, Bourbons into Braganzas, Braganzas into Wittelsbachs. If fragility haunted one family, it haunted them all. The genetic web meant that disabilities, illnesses and weaknesses travelled as surely as crowns and jewels. The whispers were not isolated. They echoed from one palace to the next, crossing borders with marriage contracts. You pass a set of double doors and overhear a conversation between courtiers, one from Vienna, one from Paris. They exchange subtle phrases. The princess is angelic. The prince is gentle of mind. To the casual ear, these sound harmless. But you, having walked through every nursery, know what they mean. They are euphemisms for children who lagged, who smiled too long, who never grew into their titles. These were codes, whispered across empires, understood universally by those in power. Here comes your first fringe tidbit. In the 18th century, diplomats sometimes noted in secret reports whether a potential bride or groom seemed delicate of intellect. These were not medical diagnoses, they were observations smuggled into coded language. Imagine a Prussian envoy describing a Bourbon princess as a pearl of beauty, but not of mind. The report would be passed in whispers to his king, who would weigh whether the alliance was worth the risk. In this way, disabilities shaped international politics, not by open debate but by subtle hesitation, by whispered warnings. Your first gentle joke rises out of the hush. Picture a diplomat scribbling, "The princess is charming, though she stares a little too long at candles." Still, perhaps her dowry will outshine her delay's politics, after all, often forgave fragility if enough gold came with it. Step further along the corridor. The air fills with the sound of quills scratching, clerks in different languages writing the same vague phrases. Delicate constitution, innocent disposition, touched by heaven. Each phrase conceals more than it reveals, yet across empires the pattern is identical. The whispers, though quiet, shaped dynasties. A quirky tidbit makes you pause. In some courts, astrologers were consulted when children seemed frail. One Habsburg astrologer insisted a prince's slowness came from Saturn's heavy influence, not from blood. Another Bourbon astrologer blamed the alignment of Venus for a princess's gentleness. Imagine courtiers nodding seriously, as if stars could explain chromosomes. Across empires, superstition filled the silence left by science. Historians still argue whether Down syndrome itself appeared frequently in royal lines, or whether the whispers merely reflect the high mortality and vague language of the time. The truth likely lies in both. Some children truly bore the condition, others were simply fragile in ways not fully understood. But the effect, the reshaping of dynastic politics, remains undeniable. Your second joke comes softly, like a jest passed between courtiers at a banquet. We fight wars to win crowns, only to have them wobble on heads too small to hold them. Cruel, yes, but you can hear the laughter of those who found irony and empire undone by genetics. You drift into a new hall where tapestries from multiple kingdoms hang side by side. One depicts Spain's Charles II, another France's Louis Joseph, another Denmark's Christian VII, another Britain's Prince John. Different languages, different centuries, but the same motif. Fragile heirs whose lives rippled outward. The corridor itself feels like a collective memory, the whispers no longer confined to one empire but woven into Europe's shared history. A quirky detail surfaces from Portugal. Some diplomats joked that fragile heirs were children for the cloister, not the crown. The phrase spread, repeated in letters across courts. It became a kind of code among elites, a way of acknowledging fragility without saying it outright. Imagine a French duke whispering it to a Spanish ambassador, both smiling grimly, both understanding the risk without spelling it out. Historians still argue how much these whispered judgments influenced major wars. Did Spain's succession war hinge not just on treaties, but on whispers of Charles II's infertility? Did the Glorious Revolution draw strength from rumours about James II's son being too weak or illegitimate? Did alliances crumble because one bride was rumoured to be simple of wit? The debate continues, but you sense how fragile cradles echoed into cannon fire. Your third joke comes like a sigh through parchment. Picture a weary envoy writing home. The empire is secure unless the heir refuses to leave his rocking horse. In that case, prepare for war. It's humour edged with truth. The deeper truth, though, is that across empires, whispers about fragile heirs were not just gossip. They were political weapons, deployed in salons, in parliaments, in taverns. Monarchies thrived on image, and fragility shattered image faster than defeat in battle. And so the whispers crossed borders as surely as armies, shaping treaties, wars, and dynastic marriages. You step out now into the final stretch of the corridor. Behind you echo the voices of courtiers in Madrid, Vienna, London, Paris, Copenhagen, Lisbon. Ahead lies only one more door, one final gallery where the candles burn low. The whispers quiet, replaced by a deep stillness, but their echoes remain, woven across centuries, a chorus of fragility hidden behind crowns. The corridor narrows, stone giving way to shadow, footsteps softening as if even sound itself hesitates. The air is cool, touched with wax and dust, the faint scent of lilies mingling with the memory of incense. You have reached the last gallery, where all the palaces and nurseries of Europe seem to collapse into one long hall. It feels neither Spanish nor Austrian, neither French nor English, but all of them together, every whisper you have gathered flowing here like tributaries into a river. This is where the story quiets, where the last candle burns low and the fragile heirs who shaped empires step into silence. The gallery is lined with empty cradles, each carved in the style of its kingdom. Gilt and velvet from Madrid, walnut from Florence, iron-bound oak from Denmark, painted pine from Stockholm, and the stiff Victorian wood of Windsor. Each one rocks faintly, though no one touches it. Shadows of infants stir inside, some smiling, some coughing, some simply still. You recognise them without names now. The Tudor cradle unearthed, the Bourbon's fragile heir, Austria's haunted nursery, Russia's snowbound secret, Bavaria's crown unworn, England's veiled rumour, the Spanish infanta's sorrow, Portugal's silent cradle, Prussia's erased children, Italy's fragile jewel, France's forgotten boy, Britain's veiled cherubs. All of them hum together, a lullaby of absence. A mainstream historical fact anchors this last hall. By the 20th century, monarchies across Europe collapsed one by one. The Russian Romanovs were executed in a basement. The Habsburgs abdicated and scattered into exile. The German Kaiser fled. The Portuguese monarchy ended in revolution. Spain's crown flickered and returned only in diminished form. Britain's endured, but even there the image of perfection cracked. Wars and revolutions brought down thrones. Yes, but always beneath the roar of cannons lay the fragility of heirs, the silence of cradles. Dynasties that once commanded continents could not command the bodies of their children. A fringe tidbit slides into the hush. In some royal archives, sealed for centuries, historians stumble upon references to unnamed children. Baptized, noted, and then erased. Sometimes the note is no more than a single line. A daughter, delicate. Sometimes it is a symbol, a cross in a margin. These are the ghosts of history's forgotten heirs, the ones who never grew old enough or strong enough to claim their names in public. The archives whisper still, even as the candles burn out. Your first gentle joke arrives like a flicker. Imagine an exhausted court scribe muttering, "We've written treaties that span hundreds of pages, but when it comes to princes too fragile for thrones, all we write is one word, delicate. Efficiency, if nothing else." The irony is sharp, but it softens the sorrow. The corridor now grows quieter. You sense that the power of these whispers was never in their rarity, but in their universality. Every empire had them. Every court concealed them. Whether through saints or sagas, relics or rumour, crowns bent under the same weight. The reality that royal children were human children. Fragile, imperfect, sometimes carrying the marks of Down syndrome or other differences that monarchies could not reconcile with their ideals of strength. A quirky tidbit surfaces from the 20th century. When modern genetic science identified Down syndrome in 1866, some physicians quietly noted that descriptions of past royals seemed to match. A few even speculated openly, though carefully, that dynastic decline could be traced not only to war and politics but to the bloodlines themselves. Imagine the discomfort of archivists realizing that the euphemisms angelic, gentle, saintly might have meant exactly what they sound like today. Historians still argue whether it matters. After all, does it change Charles II's fate to label him now? Does it alter the sorrow of Louis XVII to attach a diagnosis? Perhaps not. Yet the debates continue, because history is as much about how we tell stories as about what happened. And tonight, you have heard the stories in whispers, not diagnoses, because that is how they lived, how they were remembered, how they shaped their empires. Your second joke flickers like a final spark. Picture a weary monarch saying, "We lost half the globe, but at least we kept the family portraits looking strong." Dynastic pride, stubborn even in the face of fragility. The last cradles fade, their rocking slowing. Candles gutter one by one, shadows stretching across the hall. You realise you have walked not just through history but through silence, through the deliberate erasure of fragile heirs whose lives were deemed inconvenient. Their absence was powerful enough to topple crowns, to redraw borders, to spark revolutions, and yet their lives, however brief or hidden, ripple still. The corridor opens onto a final chamber. Here, the walls are plain, the floor bare, the air still. A single candle burns on a stone ledge, its flame steady, its wax dripping slowly. You feel your breath match its rhythm, slowing, softening. The flame flickers once, twice. Your third joke is only a whisper now. Imagine a jester leaning close to that last candle and sighing, "At least you burn steady. You'd make a better king than half of them." The smile it brings is faint, but it is enough. You stand before the candle and realise the journey has ended. The crown and the curse are the same story, that power rests on fragile bodies, that silence is as political as speeches, that history is written as much by what is hidden as by what is shown. The last candle fades, and with it, the whispers fall quiet. The hall grows softer now, the stone beneath your feet no longer cold but warm, as if memory itself has taken on a gentler glow. The candle's flame steadies, then thins, then lengthens again, its light stretching across the chamber walls in slow, languid arcs. Your breathing slows with it, shoulders loosening, jaw unclenching, thoughts smoothing like ripples on a quiet pond. All those palaces, all those nurseries, all those whispered euphemisms, they recede now into the distance like echoes across a valley. The names and dynasties blur, their grandeur dissolving into something simpler, something human. What remains is not the politics, not the crowns, not the endless lists of treaties and wars. What remains are the lullabies, the rocking cradles, the small hands reaching for light. Fragility, which once was hidden, now feels less like shame and more like reminder that behind every empire's pageantry were human hearts, tender and uncertain. Let the silence feel comforting now, not heavy. The hush that once concealed sorrow is now simply rest, a settling of dust, a quiet where nothing more is demanded. The candle flame bends, softens, steadies, as if it too is breathing with you. You let its glow hold you, not as history's final note, but as a promise that even fragility has its place in the story. The corridor fades completely, leaving only the warmth of that small light. You're no longer walking marble floors or creeping through palaces. You're simply resting in the glow, safe, quiet, and at ease. The crown and the curse, the whispers and the silences, they have told their story, and now they dissolve like mist. The last candle fades, sleep comes gently, the journey is done,